I came home from burying the love of my life feeling completely numb. My wife's phone buzzed in my pocket and I pulled it out expecting nothing, but the screen lit up with a scheduled text from her. The yellow tin, cabinet above the sink. My heart skipped a beat. What was this about? Why had she never mentioned it? Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Irving. I am 69 years old. I spent my entire life building a commercial trucking company from the ground up in the 1980s, facing down discrimination and cutthroat competitors so my family would never have to struggle. Today I buried my wife Diane after a brutal and exhausting fight with cancer. When I walked through the front door of our home, my bones ached with a grief so deep I could barely breathe. But what I saw in my living room instantly replaced my sorrow with ice-cold rage. My children and their spouses were not mourning, they were appraising. Kendall, my ambitious and arrogant son, was standing by the fireplace arguing in hushed, harsh tones with my daughter Jasmine. They were fighting over Diane's antique clock collection. Kendall insisted he deserved it because he was the eldest, while Jasmine, a woman who lived for social media clout, claimed she needed the vintage pieces to match her new living room aesthetic. Meanwhile, my white daughter-in-law Heather and Jasmine's husband Bradley were pacing around the dining room. Bradley, a real estate broker currently drowning in debt, was literally tapping the walls and writing down square footage numbers on a notepad. Heather, a bank manager, was going through the silver cabinet, weighing the heavy serving trays in her hands with calculating eyes. Not a single tear was shed. Not a single memory of their mother was spoken. I stood in the hallway observing the people I had raised and supported for decades. They thought I was just a tired, grieving old man whose mind was slipping. They thought my silence was weakness. I cleared my throat and stepped into the light. Kendall immediately dropped the clock he was holding, and Bradley shoved his notepad into his pocket. They offered fake smiles and hollow apologies about organizing things to help me out. I just stared at them, letting the heavy silence punish their greed. I nodded slowly, told them I was tired, and asked them to leave my house immediately. Once the heavy oak front door clicked shut behind them, the silence of the empty house pressed down on my shoulders. For 40 years, this home had been filled with Diane's warmth, her laughter, and her meticulous care. Now it felt like a hollow shell waiting to be picked clean by vultures. I walked into the kitchen and sat heavily at the island, staring at the empty chair where Diane used to drink her morning tea. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out her old cell phone. I had kept it charged, wanting to hold on to every last piece of her. I was staring blankly at her wallpaper photo when the screen illuminated the dark kitchen. A soft chime echoed in the quiet space. It was a scheduled message set to send exactly 4 hours after the scheduled end of her funeral service. The sender was Diane herself, using an automated messaging app. The text was short and cryptic. The yellow tin, cabinet above the sink. My breath caught in my throat. Diane never did anything without a specific reason. She was not a woman prone to dramatic mysteries or senseless riddles. If she sent this message to arrive exactly when she knew I would be alone in the house after laying her to rest, it meant something critical was hidden there, something she could not tell me while she was alive. I stood up, my knees popping in the quiet room, and walked over to the sink. My hands were trembling slightly, not from old age, but from a sudden, overwhelming sense of anticipation. I opened the upper cabinet. Behind the spare coffee mugs and boxes of herbal tea sat an old, faded yellow tin box. It was a vintage cookie tin Diane had kept for decades. I pulled it down. It was surprisingly heavy. I placed the yellow tin on the granite counter, taking a moment to gather myself. Diane was a former head nurse at a major city hospital. She had spent 30 years running emergency rooms, managing chaotic situations, and seeing right through people's lies. She was the most observant and sharp-minded person I had ever known. Nothing slipped past her. She noticed the slight shifts in a patient's breathing just as easily as she noticed a lie forming on someone's lips. When her cancer returned aggressively, she knew her time was short. But instead of falling into despair, she became incredibly focused. I thought she was just organizing her affairs, making sure I knew how to run the washing machine and pay the property taxes. She spent hours on her laptop, organizing files and making quiet phone calls when she thought I was asleep. I assumed it was her way of coping with the end. Now, staring at this yellow tin, I realized her meticulous preparation was not about teaching me how to live without her. It was about protecting me from the people she knew would attack the moment she was gone. She had seen the greed in Kendall's eyes and the calculation in Heather's smile long before I was willing to admit my children were fatally flawed. With a deep breath, I pried the tight lid off the yellow tin. It made a sharp metallic pop that echoed in the empty kitchen. Inside, I did not find old photographs or sentimental love letters. Instead, the tin was packed with items that sent a shockwave of cold, hard reality straight through my chest. There was a small black USB drive, a thick leather-bound ledger, and a cheap prepaid burner phone. On top of these items rested a single sheet of folded hospital stationery. I picked up the paper and unfolded it. Diane's familiar, elegant handwriting covered the page. It started with a simple phrase that made my blood run cold. "My dearest Irving, if you are reading this, they have already shown you their true faces. Do not trust them. Do not sign anything. Look at the ledger." I picked up the heavy leather ledger and opened it to the first page. Row after row of dates, account numbers, and transaction details filled the columns. As my eyes scanned the precise figures, my grief was instantly replaced by an unyielding fury. Diane had spent her final dying months investigating our own family. And what she uncovered in this book was a betrayal so deep, so malicious, it would destroy everything I thought I knew about my children. I traced my calloused finger down the first column of the ledger. Diane had documented every single transaction with the precision of a surgical nurse. April 14th. $2,000 transferred from my primary retirement account to a secondary checking account. May 2nd. $4,500 wired to an external vendor. The list went on. Page after page of unauthorized withdrawals spanning the last 2 years. Beside each entry, Diane had taped printed screenshots of bank authorization logs. Every single transfer bore the digital signature and employee identification number of the branch manager authorizing the override. That ID belonged to Heather, my sweet and caring daughter-in-law who always brought me sugar-free cookies on Sunday afternoons had been systematically bleeding my retirement fund dry. She used her executive clearance at the bank to bypass security alerts and hide the missing funds. Diane even included a small handwritten note on the margin. "She makes small withdrawals, Irving." Just enough to avoid triggering federal banking alarms, but enough to steal over $80,000 so far. I plugged the black USB drive into my laptop. Folders popped up on the screen meticulously labeled by Diane. There were bank statements, email records, and downloaded transaction histories. One folder contained emails Heather had sent to Bradley coordinating how to mask the missing funds by shuffling money between my investment portfolios. They were manipulating the physical statements mailed to my house. Suddenly, the strange conversations from the past year made terrifying sense. I remembered questioning a missing $5,000 a few months ago. Heather had sat right at this kitchen table patting my hand with a condescending smile. She told me I had requested that withdrawal for roof repairs and simply forgot. When I argued, she looked at me with fake pity and asked if my memory was slipping lately. She gaslighted me in my own home. She made me believe my mind was failing while she robbed me blind. The sheer audacity of her deceit felt like a physical blow to my chest, a profound and ultimate betrayal. I did not inherit wealth. I earned every single penny sitting in that ledger. Back in the 1980s, I drove 18-wheelers across the country. I faced racial slurs at truck stops and dealt with cutthroat dispatchers who wanted to see a black-owned trucking business fail. I slept in my cab and ate cold sandwiches to save money until I could buy my second truck, then my third, then a fleet of 40. I negotiated contracts with ruthless shipping magnates and survived economic recessions. When I finally sold the company 10 years ago, I secured a multi-million-dollar nest egg. I thought the hard part of my life was over. I thought I could finally rest. But the business world of logistics and freight was entirely different from the modern digital banking landscape. That was my fatal mistake. When Heather married Kendall, she presented herself as a financial expert. She insisted on helping us set up automatic bill pay and online banking. She said she wanted to protect her father-in-law from the confusing new banking systems and online scammers. I trusted her implicitly. I handed over my account numbers and authorization pins because she was family. I believed my son had married a woman who truly cared about us. Instead, he married a predator. And Kendall had to know. My own son, the boy I taught to ride a bicycle and paid to send to an expensive business school, was letting his wife steal my life savings. The grief over Diane transformed entirely. The sorrow evaporated, leaving behind a cold, calculated resolve. I was not the weak, confused old man they desperately wanted me to be. I was the man who survived the toughest freight routes in America. They had mistaken my quiet retirement for defenselessness. I closed the ledger and stared at the USB drive. I needed to call my attorney, Mr. Harrington, immediately to secure my assets, but before I could even reach for my phone, heavy footsteps echoed on the front porch. A loud, aggressive knock rattled the front door. Someone turned a key in the lock. I quickly shut the laptop, shoved the ledger and the USB drive back into the yellow tin, and pushed it deep into the pantry cabinet behind a bag of flour. I barely managed to close the cabinet door before Kendall barged into the kitchen. He did not knock to ask permission. He knocked to announce his invasion. He stood in the doorway, still wearing his expensive black funeral suit, but his tie was loosened. He looked impatient and annoyed. He held a manila folder tightly in his right hand. He did not ask how I was doing. He did not offer a comforting word about the mother he had just put in the ground. He simply tossed the folder onto the granite island. "I need you to sign this, Dad," he said. His voice was clipped and authoritative. "What is this?" I asked, keeping my tone soft and weary. "It is a temporary power of attorney," Kendall replied without making eye contact. He pulled a silver pen from his breast pocket and clicked it. "Mom handled a lot of the household bills. Now that she is gone, I know you are going to be overwhelmed. Heather and I discussed it. We are going to take over your financial management so you do not have to stress yourself out during this difficult grieving period. Just sign on the dotted line." He tapped the pen on the document. His audacity was breathtaking. Less than 6 hours after his mother's funeral, he was standing in my kitchen trying to legally strip me of my financial autonomy. He wanted the keys to the kingdom. He wanted unrestricted access to the millions I had locked away in investments that Heather could not reach with her sneaky branch manager overrides. If I signed that paper, they could legally liquidate everything I owned by tomorrow morning. I looked at the document. Then I looked at my son. If I refused outright, he would know I was suspicious. If I fought him, he would escalate the situation before I had time to secure my assets with Mr. Harrington. I needed to buy time. I needed to play the exact role they had cast me in. The helpless, confused, and broken widower. I let my shoulders slump. I made my hands shake deliberately as I reached for the document. I stared at the dense legal text, letting my eyes dart around as if I could not comprehend the words. Kendall sighed loudly, tapping his foot on the hardwood floor. "Come on, Dad," he urged. "It is standard procedure. Just sign it." I reached for my mug of cold black coffee with a trembling hand. As I brought the mug toward my face, I intentionally let my grip slip. The heavy ceramic mug crashed onto the kitchen island. Dark brown liquid splashed directly over the manila folder, soaking the legal document in seconds. Kendall jumped back, cursing loudly as the coffee splattered onto his polished leather shoes. "What is wrong with you?" he shouted, grabbing paper towels to wipe his suit. "I am so sorry, son," I whispered, forcing my voice to crack. I put my head in my hands and let out a ragged, convincing sob. "My hands are just so shaky today. I cannot think straight. My eyes are blurry. I cannot read these small letters right now. I just miss your mother so much." Kendall stared at the ruined document with sheer frustration. He crumpled the wet paper and threw it into the trash can. He looked at me with an expression of pure disgust. "Fine," he snapped. "Get some sleep. Heather is coming over tomorrow morning to check on you. We will get fresh copies printed. You are signing them tomorrow, Dad." He turned around and stormed out of the house, slamming the front door behind him. I stayed seated with my head in my hands until I heard his car engine start and fade down the street. Then I lifted my head. My tears vanished instantly. My hand stopped shaking. The performance was over. The war had officially begun. The sun had barely crested the horizon when the doorbell chimed. I was already awake. In fact, I had not slept a single minute. I spent the dark hours of the morning pacing my study, finalizing the first phase of my retaliation. When I opened the front door, Heather was standing on my porch, holding a glass container of homemade chicken noodle soup. She wore a tailored beige trench coat and a sympathetic smile that could have won an award for acting. She looked exactly like the pristine, polished banking executive she was. To the rest of the world, she was the perfect white daughter-in-law checking on her grieving black father-in-law. To me, she was a parasite wrapped in designer clothing. "Good morning, Irving," she said softly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "Kendall told me about the little accident with the coffee last night. I know you must be feeling so overwhelmed." She walked straight to the kitchen, placing the soup on the granite counter. She turned to me with her head tilted, her eyes wide with manufactured pity. She placed her cool, manicured hands over mine, squeezing them tightly. "Irving, we need to have a serious talk. Kendall and I are very concerned about you. Your memory has been slipping for months now. You have been repeating yourself, and last night Kendall said your hands were shaking so badly you could not even hold a simple coffee mug." I stared at her, keeping my face perfectly slack. The psychological manipulation was so textbook it was almost insulting. She was laying the groundwork to declare me incompetent. "I was just tired, Heather. Diane just passed. It has been a hard week." "I know you are grieving," she interrupted, her tone dripping with fake sweetness. "But cognitive decline accelerates during traumatic events. Dementia is a very real possibility at your age, Irving. Diane was a nurse, and she would never want you struggling to manage complex financial portfolios while your mind is vulnerable. You could fall victim to scammers. You could make a terrible financial mistake and lose everything you worked for. You need to let me take the wheel. I manage money for a living. Let me protect you." Her words were designed to strip away my confidence and replace it with fear. She wanted me to second-guess my own sanity. She wanted me to believe I was a fragile old man who needed her banking expertise to survive. I let my shoulders droop. I forced my breathing to become shallow and ragged. I looked down at my slippers, acting like a defeated, broken man who had finally realized his own mind was failing him. "Maybe you are right, Heather," I whispered, letting my voice tremble just enough to sound authentic. "Everything is just so confusing right now. The numbers, the bills, the bank accounts. It is all too much for me to handle without Diane." Her eyes flared with a predatory triumph. She could not completely hide the greedy smirk forming on her lips. She had me exactly where she wanted me. "I am so glad you understand, Irving. Kendall has the new power of attorney papers in his car for later, but for right now, I think it is best if I hold on to your primary credit cards and your bank access tokens, just to keep them safe. I will manage all the household expenses for you from now on." I nodded, slowly shuffling toward my coat hanging by the door. I reached into my leather wallet and pulled out a sleek silver platinum card. It was a secondary credit account linked to my main business portfolio. I handed it to her with a hesitant, shaky motion. "This is the card Diane used for the big expenses," I mumbled, looking at the floor. "Please keep it safe for me." Heather snatched the card from my hand so fast she almost clipped my fingers. She slipped it into her designer purse with a satisfied pat. What my dear daughter-in-law did not know was that at 3 a.m. I had logged into my secure banking portal and locked that specific card completely. I had reduced the daily spending limit to $0 and flagged it for suspicious activity. It was nothing more than a useless piece of plastic, but holding it made her feel invincible. She thought she possessed the key to my fortune. "You are doing the right thing, Irving," she cooed, leaning in to give me a stiff, uncomfortable hug. "You just rest today. Drink the soup. Kendall will drop by tonight so we can finalize the legal paperwork. We are going to take great care of everything." The moment her expensive heels clicked down the driveway and her luxury vehicle disappeared around the corner, my fragile posture vanished. I locked the deadbolt, secured the heavy chain, and marched straight back to the pantry. I pulled the yellow tin out from behind the bags of flour and grabbed the black USB drive. I plugged it back into my laptop. The night before, I had only focused on the bank ledgers, but Diane was incredibly thorough. She would not leave a burner phone and a USB drive just for financial records. I opened the main directory and began clicking through the folders again. There was a hidden encrypted file named with our wedding anniversary date. I typed the numbers in and the folder unlocked immediately. Inside were a dozen audio files. I clicked on the most recent one, dated just 3 weeks before Diane passed away. I turned up the volume on my computer speakers, leaning closer to the screen. The audio was muffled at first, clearly recorded secretly from inside Diane's purse or jacket pocket. Then a male voice spoke. It was Dr. Aris, Diane's lead oncologist. He was explaining a new experimental immunotherapy treatment. He said the clinical trials had an 80% success rate for her specific type of aggressive cancer. He sounded incredibly optimistic. He said it could potentially grant her several more years of high-quality life, allowing us to grow old together just as we planned. Then Dr. Aris mentioned the cost. $100,000 completely out of pocket because health insurance would not cover an experimental trial. Before Diane could even speak, Kendall's voice cut through the recording. "That is absurd," my son said, his tone cold and calculating. "My mother is nearly 70 years old. Putting her through a grueling experimental trial is just cruel. We are not going to waste $100,000 on false hope. It is time to focus on palliative care." Heather immediately chimed in, backing him up without missing a beat. "Exactly, doctor. We have to be realistic here. We cannot drain Irving's retirement savings on a long shot. He needs that money for his own future care. We are choosing comfort care for Diane from here on out." I sat frozen in my kitchen chair. The breath was completely knocked out of my lungs. They did not just steal my money. They had actively prevented my wife from receiving a treatment that could have saved her life. They condemned her to an agonizing death simply because they wanted to protect their inheritance. They let my Diane die for $100,000. The financial theft was a terrible crime, but this was murder. Pure, calculated murder committed by my own flesh and blood. A dark, suffocating rage settled over my heart, freezing my blood. The game of playing the confused old man was no longer just about protecting my assets from a greedy son and an entitled daughter-in-law. It was about exacting a merciless, absolute vengeance for the woman I loved. They thought they were playing me, but they had just awakened a man who had nothing left to lose. I sat at the kitchen table while the horrifying truth of my wife's death echoed in my ears. I barely had time to process the magnitude of their crime before the sound of a key turning in the front door shattered the silence. I did not even have the chance to wipe the tears of rage from my eyes. The heavy oak door swung open. My daughter Jasmine walked in, followed closely by her white husband Bradley. Jasmine was dressed head to toe in designer clothes, holding her phone up to record a video for her social media followers. Behind them trailed a stranger wearing a cheap suit and carrying a laser tape measure. They did not knock. They simply invaded my sanctuary like a team of corporate liquidators. Bradley pointed to the crown molding and whispered something to the stranger, who immediately began taking measurements of my living room. Jasmine strutted into the kitchen, her heels clicking loudly on the tile. She barely glanced at me sitting at the island. Instead, she opened the refrigerator, complained about the lack of sparkling water, and then finally acknowledged my presence. "Hey, Dad," she said, casually waving a manicured hand. "Do not mind us. Bradley is just having a buddy look at the floor plan. We are thinking about some renovation ideas to help you out. Help me out." I watched the stranger shine a red laser beam against the custom mahogany bookshelves Diane and I had installed 30 years ago. He was not a contractor. I knew a real estate appraiser when I saw one. They were literally sizing up my home while the dirt on my wife's grave was still fresh. I stood up slowly, using the edge of the counter for support, making sure my hands trembled just enough to maintain the illusion of a broken old man. "What is going on here, Jasmine?" I asked, letting my voice waver. "Who is that man in my living room?" Bradley rushed into the kitchen, practically shoving his phone into his pocket. He always had a frantic, nervous energy about him, like a man constantly looking over his shoulder. His slicked back hair and forced salesman smile made my stomach turn. "Now, Dad, do not get worked up," Bradley said, putting a heavy hand on my shoulder. "We are just trying to get ahead of the curve. Things are going to get incredibly difficult for you financially in the coming weeks, and we want to make sure you are protected." I looked up at my son-in-law, projecting pure confusion. "Difficult financially," I repeated. "What do you mean, Bradley? The house is fully paid off. Diane and I never carried debt." Bradley sighed heavily, adopting a tone of deep artificial sympathy. He pulled out a bar stool and sat across from me, leaning in close as if sharing a terrible burden. "Dad, it is about Diane's medical bills. The hospital called me this morning because you were not answering your phone. The treatments, the hospice care, the specialists. It is astronomical. Insurance refused to cover the final 2 months of her intensive care. You are looking at hundreds of thousands of dollars in medical debt. They are going to put a lien on this house by the end of the month if we do not act immediately." I stared at his pale face, masking the absolute fury burning inside my chest. Diane was a highly respected head nurse for 3 decades. She had premium gold tier medical coverage. Beyond that, we had paid every single out-of-pocket deductible the moment the invoices arrived. I knew for an absolute fact that my wife died with a zero balance at that hospital. Bradley was looking me right in the eyes and telling a bold-faced, despicable lie. I knew exactly why he was lying. Bradley was a real estate broker who liked to play high roller, but he was remarkably terrible at his job. Over the past year, he had lost a massive fortune gambling on cryptocurrency and highly leveraged commercial property investments. He was drowning in debt. He needed a quick, massive infusion of cash to save himself from bankruptcy. My fully paid-off four-bedroom home situated in one of the most desirable neighborhoods in the city was his golden ticket. If he could convince me to sell it in a panic, he would pocket the broker commission and undoubtedly funnel the sale proceeds directly into his own failing bank accounts. Jasmine stopped tapping on her phone and walked over, placing her hand on my arm. "Dad, we cannot let the hospital take the house," she whined, pouting her lips. "Bradley has a private cash buyer lined up who can close in 3 days. We can avoid the market completely. You will not have to deal with open houses or strangers touching your things. We will take care of the entire sale, and you will not be homeless. We cleaned out the basement at our place. We are going to set up a nice little bed down there for you. You can live with us. You will be safe. They wanted to sell my home out from under me, steal the equity, and lock me in their damp, unfinished basement like an unwanted piece of luggage. My own daughter. The girl I had worked double shifts to put through private school was standing in my kitchen treating me like a disposable asset to fund her husband's bad gambling habits. I kept my face blank, letting a tear pool in the corner of my eye. I blinked it away slowly. "So much debt," I whispered, sounding completely crushed. I had no idea Diane left us with such a burden. "Are you sure they will take the house, Bradley?" He nodded grimly, patting my shoulder again. "I am positive, Dad. But do not worry. I am going to handle the heavy lifting. All I need from you is the original property deed to show the cash buyer that the title is clear." I lowered my head and let out a long, trembling sigh. "You kids are so good to me," I murmured, my voice cracking perfectly. "I do not know what I would do without you. I will go find the deed. Give me a few minutes to look through Diane's old filing cabinet in the study. My memory is just so foggy today." Jasmine smiled brightly, her eyes gleaming with dollar signs. "Take your time, Dad," she said, already turning her attention back to her glowing phone screen. Bradley quickly walked back into the living room to hurry the appraiser along. I shuffled out of the kitchen, dragging my feet across the hardwood floor, playing the part of the defeated senior citizen to absolute perfection. I walked down the hall and entered my private study. The moment I crossed the threshold, I closed the heavy solid wood door and quietly slid the brass lock into place. My posture straightened instantly. The fake tremors in my hands vanished. I walked over to my mahogany desk and pulled my cell phone from my pocket. I dialed a number I knew by heart. The line rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered. Arthur Harrington speaking. Mr. Harrington was my personal attorney, a sharp, ruthless corporate lawyer who had helped me navigate the vicious logistics industry 30 years ago. He was one of the few men I trusted completely. "Arthur," I said, my voice dropping an octave, returning to its normal, commanding tone. "It is Irving. The vultures have landed." "Irving, my old friend," Mr. Harrington replied, his tone instantly shifting to high alert. "Tell me what is happening." I gave him a rapid, concise rundown of the situation. I told him about Heather stealing from my retirement accounts, Kendall attempting to force a power of attorney, and now Bradley trying to fraudulently sell my home to cover his own debts. I did not mention the audio recording of Diane's murder yet. I needed to handle the financial lockdown first. "Arthur, I need an impenetrable fortress," I said, gripping the edge of my desk. "I want every single liquid asset, every investment portfolio, and the deed to this house transferred into an irrevocable trust immediately. I want my children completely legally locked out. Consider it done, Irving, Mr." Harrington said, the sound of furious typing echoing in the background. "I will draft the trust documents and initiate the emergency asset freeze within the hour. By the time they try to move a single dime, they will hit a solid brick wall." I thanked him and hung up the phone. I opened the bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a random stack of old tax returns, placing them in a manila folder. It was time to give my desperate son-in-law exactly enough rope to hang himself. I walked out of my study, clutching the thick manila folder of outdated tax returns. I shuffled back into the living room where Bradley and Jasmine were waiting with hungry, impatient eyes. I handed the folder to Bradley, making sure my hands trembled perfectly on cue. I told him I could not find the original property deed, but maybe these old property tax records would help his cash buyer see the home's value. Bradley snatched the folder with a greedy grin, completely oblivious to the fact that those papers were entirely useless for a legal property transfer. He assured me he would handle the rest and rushed Jasmine out the front door before I could change my mind. The moment their car pulled out of the driveway, my fragile persona vanished entirely. I grabbed my keys, walked out the back door, and drove straight downtown to the main corporate headquarters of my bank. I completely bypassed the suburban branch where Heather worked. I was not going to give her a single digital footprint of my movements. Mr. Harrington was already waiting for me in a private glass-walled conference room on the 20th floor. He slid a massive stack of legal documents across the polished mahogany table. We wasted no time. Within 45 minutes, I signed away direct control of my entire financial empire. We established a fully armored, irrevocable trust. I transferred every liquid asset, every mutual fund, my entire retirement portfolio, and the absolute deed to my home into the trust. I named Mr. Harrington as the primary co-trustee. This legal maneuver meant that even if Kendall managed to forge a power of attorney, or if Heather tried to initiate a backdoor wire transfer, the bank systems would demand Mr. Harrington's direct physical signature and a rigorous legal review. I deliberately stripped myself of the ability to unilaterally withdraw large sums of cash. If my children put a gun to my head and dragged me to a teller, the bank would legally refuse the transaction. The fortress was built. My wealth was completely insulated from their greedy hands. I shook Mr. Harrington's hand, felt a deep sense of grim satisfaction, and drove back to my empty house to wait for the fireworks. The explosion did not take long. The automated financial guillotine dropped precisely at 9 o'clock the next morning. It was the first of the month. The exact day Heather usually executed her stealthy transfers to avoid detection, and the day Jasmine's luxury auto drafts processed. I sat at my kitchen island, calmly sipping my black coffee and eating a slice of toast. I placed my cell phone flat on the granite counter and watched the show begin. At exactly 9:14, the screen lit up. It was Heather. The call went unanswered. 2 minutes later, another call. Then a text message flashed across the screen. Irving, the banking system is showing an error on your primary accounts. Did you authorize a security freeze? Please call me immediately so I can fix this for you. I took a slow sip of my coffee and smiled. She was panicking. Her administrative access had been completely revoked and she was staring at a digital brick wall. 10 minutes later, Jasmine's face appeared on my caller ID. She called 3 times in rapid succession. Then the frantic texts poured in. Dad, my platinum card just declined at the designer boutique. The cashier humiliated me in front of everyone. What is going on with the accounts? Call me back right now. I did not touch the phone. I let the missed calls pile up. 30 calls, 40 calls. Their desperation was a palpable living thing vibrating through the device. They were experiencing the terrifying freefall of losing their unearned financial safety net. Without my money to prop up their fake, lavish lifestyles, they were absolutely nothing. I spent the rest of the day tending to Diane's rose garden in the backyard, completely ignoring the digital meltdown occurring inside the house. I knew they would not settle for ignored text messages. The true confrontation was brewing, and I was more than ready for the collision. At 11 o'clock that night, the quiet peace of my neighborhood was shattered by the screech of tires in my driveway. Heavy, aggressive pounding shook my front door. It was not a polite knock. It was the frantic hammering of people who believed they owned the place and demanded entry. I took my time. I slipped on my worn flannel robe, messed up my hair, and shuffled slowly down the hallway. I unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open, leaving the chain engaged. Kendall and Jasmine stood on the porch under the yellow glow of the security light. They looked unhinged. Kendall's tie was gone, and his face was flushed with pure anger. Jasmine had mascara smudged under her eyes, clearly distraught from her public humiliation. "Dad, open this door," Kendall demanded, his voice echoing loudly in the quiet street. "What did you do to the bank accounts? Heather is locked out of the system and my credit lines are frozen." I blinked at them, keeping my eyes wide and vacant. I unhooked the chain and let them push their way into the foyer. I pulled my robe tighter around my chest, shrinking away from their aggressive posturing. "Bank accounts," I mumbled, letting my voice waver with artificial confusion. "I do not know what you mean, Kendall. I was just trying to pay the electricity bill yesterday online. The computer kept asking for passwords I could not remember. I think I pressed the wrong buttons. The nice lady on the customer service line told me she would lock it down to keep the hackers away." Jasmine let out a theatrical shriek, stomping her expensive boots on the hardwood. "You locked everything down because you forgot a password. Dad, you left me stranded at the boutique. My card was declined. Do you know how embarrassing that was? I had to leave $2,000 worth of merchandise on the counter." I shook my head, looking absolutely pathetic. "I am so sorry, sweetie. My mind is just so foggy without your mother here to organize the bills." The numbers just get all jumbled up in my head. I thought I was protecting us from the internet thieves. Kendall rubbed his temples, taking deep, angry breaths to control his temper. He looked at me, not with the concern of a son, but with the sheer frustration of a thief whose lockpick had just broken in the keyhole. "This is exactly why you need to sign the power of attorney, Dad," he snapped, pointing a stiff finger at my chest. "You are making massive financial mistakes. You are a liability to yourself. Heather will go to the main branch tomorrow and clear up this mess." I kept my head bowed, hiding the cold, predatory gleam in my eyes. They had completely bought the act. They believed my cognitive decline was the cause of their frozen funds. They had no idea they had just crashed headfirst into an impenetrable legal wall constructed by a man who was fully awake and entirely ruthless. Kendall paced the length of my foyer, rubbing his temples as if my mere existence was an unbearable headache. Jasmine collapsed onto the entryway bench, crossing her arms and glaring at me with raw contempt. I maintained my hunched posture, staring blankly at the polished floorboards. "I need the security tokens," Dad Kendall barked, holding out his hand. "Give me the two-factor authentication device Heather set up for you. I will call the fraud department right now and override the lock." I shook my head slowly, raising my hands in a helpless, trembling gesture. "I do not have it, Kendall," I whispered. "The bank lady on the phone told me the account is frozen pending a physical verification. She said I answered the security questions wrong too many times. They asked me for your mother's maiden name, and my mind just went completely blank." I panicked. The computer locked me out to protect me from hackers. Jasmine let out a loud, dramatic groan that echoed off the high ceilings. "You forgot Grandma's maiden name. Are you kidding me, Dad? My entire life is on hold because you cannot remember a simple word. Do you have any idea how much stress this is causing me? I had a personal styling appointment at the designer boutique today. My platinum card declined in front of the entire store. The cashier humiliated me. I had to leave $2,000 worth of merchandise on the counter and walk out like a peasant." Kendall slammed his fist against the wall, making the framed family photographs rattle against the drywall. "This is exactly what Heather warned us about," he shouted. "You are a danger to your own wealth. You cannot manage a basic utility bill without triggering a federal fraud alert. Tomorrow morning you are getting in my car and we are driving to the main branch. You will sign the release forms and transfer full administrative control to Heather. No more delays, no more excuses." I nodded meekly, letting my lower lip quiver. "Whatever you say, son. I just want to go back to bed. My chest hurts and I am so very tired." Kendall sneered, turning away from me. "Unbelievable," he muttered under his breath. As I watched my son throw a tantrum over a locked bank account, a profound sense of clarity washed over me. I looked at his perfectly manicured hands and his expensive Italian leather shoes. I looked at Jasmine crying over a declined credit card while wearing a jacket that cost more than my first car. They were incredibly soft. They had lived their entire lives shielded by the financial fortress I built, and now they thought they could simply command the fortress to open its gates. They mistook my age for weakness. They had absolutely no idea what kind of man their father truly was. My mind drifted back to the winter of 1984. I was stranded at a freezing, desolate truck stop in rural Ohio. I had exactly 2 freight rigs to my name and a racist dispatch broker who flat out refused to pay a black man his legally negotiated rate. That night, 2 rival drivers slashed the tires on my primary rig, trying to force me out of the logistics route. I did not call the police. I did not cry about how unfair the world was. I patched those heavy tires in sub-zero temperatures, drove straight to the broker's office at dawn, and kicked his solid wood door off the hinges. I stood over his desk and made it abundantly clear that I would not be intimidated, broken, or robbed. I secured my payment in cash and systematically took 3 of his best corporate contracts before the month ended. I built my logistics empire by surviving storms that would have crushed lesser men. I navigated corporate sharks, corrupt union bosses, and ruthless competitors. I thrived in the cutthroat darkness of the freight industry, where a single misstep meant bankruptcy. I did not survive decades of that brutal grind to be bullied in my own foyer by a boy whose greatest hardship was a delayed direct deposit. I was not a frail old man losing his grip on reality. I was an apex predator patiently waiting in the shallows. Kendall pulled his phone from his pocket and marched toward the kitchen, dialing a number. Jasmine followed him, dragging her feet and complaining bitterly about her ruined evening. I remained in the foyer, leaning heavily against the wall until they rounded the corner. Once they were out of sight, my posture transformed. I stood up perfectly straight. My spine popped, but my steps were entirely silent. I moved swiftly down the hallway, slipping into the dark dining room that connected directly to the kitchen. I stood motionless in the shadows, pressing my back against the cool plaster wall, listening intently. Kendall had put his phone on speaker and set it on the granite island. Bradley's voice echoed from the device, sounding panicked and completely out of breath. "Did you fix the accounts?" Bradley demanded immediately. "I have aggressive creditors breathing down my neck, Kendall. The cash buyer for the house is threatening to walk away if we do not provide a clear title by Friday morning." The old man locked the accounts by failing the basic security questions. Kendall spat. "Heather is going to drag him to the bank tomorrow to force a total managerial override." "But what about the house? Did you use the property tax documents he gave you?" I heard Bradley let out a harsh, bitter laugh. "Those tax returns are completely useless, Kendall. I cannot initiate a property transfer without the original deed or a legally binding signature. But I am not waiting around for his foggy brain to find the right paperwork. We are bypassing him entirely." "What do you mean?" Jasmine asked, her voice tight with anxiety. "I have a guy," Bradley said, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "He works out of a title escrow office downtown. For $10,000, he will draft a duplicate deed and forge your father's signature perfectly. He will backdate it and notarize it with a fake seal. Once the paperwork is filed, the house belongs to the buyer and the cash is wired directly to my offshore holding account. We will distribute the funds from there to cover my debts and get Heather's bank records clean." "Are you sure this guy is reliable?" Kendall asked, showing absolutely no moral hesitation about committing a federal crime against his own father. "He is a professional," Bradley assured him. "By Friday afternoon, the house is sold. We will pack up your dad's clothes and move him into my basement this weekend. He is so confused right now, he probably will not even realize he does not own the property anymore." I stood in the darkness of the dining room, my heart beating with a slow, rhythmic precision. Bradley was not just planning to sell my home out from under me. He was actively orchestrating felony forgery and massive real estate fraud. He was handing me the exact legal ammunition I needed to completely destroy him. I smiled in the pitch-black room. The trap was fully set. All I had to do now was let them walk right into it. I waited in the pitch-black dining room until I heard Kendall and Jasmine finally walk out the front door. The heavy deadbolt clicked into place. Their car engine roared to life and tires screeched down the quiet suburban street. I was entirely alone again. The house was dead silent, but my mind was operating at a terrifying speed. I walked back to the kitchen and retrieved the yellow tin from the pantry cabinet. I carried it straight to my secure study and locked the solid oak door behind me. I sat heavily at my mahogany desk. The black USB drive had already revealed Heather's financial theft and their callous conversation with the doctor. But there was still one item in the tin I had not fully examined: the cheap prepaid burner phone. I picked up the small plastic device. It felt unnaturally heavy in my palm. I pressed the power button and the small screen glowed to life. Diane had bypassed the lock screen entirely. There was a single folder on the home screen labeled simply with the word "Listen." I tapped the folder. Inside were dozens of recorded phone calls. Diane had somehow cloned or intercepted the calls coming to and from Kendall's personal cell phone. I pressed play on a file dated exactly 1 week before my wife passed away. The audio hissed with static before Kendall's voice came through loud and clear. He was on speakerphone talking to Heather. I leaned closer to the device, my heart hammering against my ribs. "I cannot believe Dr. Aris almost convinced Dad to try that experimental trial," Kendall said, his voice dripping with pure disgust. $100,000 out of pocket. Dad would have liquidated the high-yield mutual funds in a heartbeat. He is so blinded by his attachment to her he cannot see the financial ruin it would cause us. Heather replied, her tone chillingly calm and pragmatic. "I handled it, Kendall. You do not need to worry." I pulled Dr. Aris aside after the consultation. I showed him the medical power of attorney we drafted last year. I looked him right in the eye and told him Diane's explicit wishes were comfort care only. I made sure to emphasize that your father was too emotionally compromised and unstable to make rational medical decisions. A sickening pause hung in the audio recording. Then Kendall spoke again. "Good. If she lived another 5 years, those ongoing medical bills and trial treatments would drain our entire inheritance. She is going to die anyway, Heather. The cancer is terminal. We are just speeding up the inevitable to protect the family assets. I handled the nursing staff too." Heather added, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "I slipped the night shift nurse a few $100 in an envelope. I told her Diane was in extreme pain and needed her morphine dosage maximized around the clock. They are keeping her heavily sedated. She will sleep right through to the end. It is cleaner this way. She will not be able to talk to Irving, and he will not be able to ask her any more questions about the bank accounts. The recording clicked off. The silence in my study was absolute and suffocating. The air was entirely pulled from my lungs. I sat frozen in my leather chair, staring blindly at the dark wall. They did not just stand by and let her die. They actively orchestrated her demise. They forged a medical power of attorney to override my authority as her husband. They bribed a hospital worker to drug my wife into a pharmaceutical coma so she could not expose their financial crimes. They robbed me of my final conversations with the woman I loved. I remembered sitting by Diane's hospital bed, holding her frail hand, begging her to open her eyes and speak to me one last time. I thought the cancer was taking her away. I thought God was calling her home. But it was not cancer, and it was not God. It was a massive dose of unauthorized morphine ordered by my own daughter-in-law and sanctioned by my own son. The physical reaction hit me like a freight train. I dropped the burner phone onto the desk. I gripped the edge of the mahogany wood until my knuckles turned bright white and the wood splintered beneath my fingernails. A raw, visceral agony ripped through my chest. I fell to my knees on the expensive Persian rug, gasping for air. The grief was blinding and absolute. For 40 years I had loved that boy. I worked 80-hour weeks driving big rigs through treacherous ice storms so Kendall could sleep in a warm bed. I paid for his pristine private schooling. I bought his first car. I gave him everything a father could possibly give to ensure he would grow into an honorable man, and he repaid me by murdering his mother for a bank balance. As I knelt there on the floor, breathing in the quiet dust of my study, the crushing sorrow began to undergo a violent, terrifying transformation. The hot tears burning my eyes suddenly went ice cold. The overwhelming grief crystallized into something entirely different. It hardened into pure, unadulterated, ruthless malice. I slowly stood back up. I straightened my posture. I looked at my reflection in the dark window pane. The man looking back at me was no longer a grieving widower. He was no longer a father dealing with wayward, ungrateful children. That man died tonight. The person standing in this study was an executioner preparing the gallows. I felt absolutely zero mercy. Every shred of paternal instinct, every lingering drop of familial love was incinerated in the furnace of my rage. Kendall, Jasmine, Heather, and Bradley were no longer my family. They were a hostile parasitic infection that had destroyed my home and murdered my wife. I would not simply cut them off financially. I would not just kick them out onto the street. That was far too kind. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire lives. I was going to strip them of their freedom, their dignity, and their future. I was going to make sure they spent the rest of their miserable lives rotting behind the cold steel bars of a federal penitentiary. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and sat back down at my desk. My mind was sharp, focused, and deadly. I placed the burner phone carefully into the hidden floor safe, bolted beneath my desk, locking the undeniable proof of their medical homicide away. I opened my encrypted laptop and drafted a highly secure email to Arthur Harrington. I did not mince words. I instructed him to immediately hire the most ruthless private investigator in the city. I needed a full background check on every single nurse working the oncology ward during Diane's final 2 weeks. I wanted financial records scrubbed for any sudden cash deposits. I needed the name and badge number of the corrupt nurse Heather had bribed. Next, I detailed the exact trap we were going to spring on Bradley. I told Arthur about the $10,000 forgery plan and the duplicate property deed. I instructed my lawyer to contact his connections at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We were going to turn a simple real estate fraud case into a massive federal sting operation. I wanted federal agents waiting in the wings the exact second Bradley tried to execute the fraudulent sale. Finally, I prepared myself for the immediate battle awaiting me at sunrise. Kendall had threatened to bring a doctor to evaluate my mental state to force a legal guardianship. I knew exactly what they were planning to do. They wanted a piece of paper declaring me legally insane so they could bypass the trust fund I had just created. I opened my desk drawer and pulled out a microscopic digital audio recorder. I charged the battery and pinned it carefully to the inside lapel of my favorite thick-knit cardigan. I knew exactly how I was going to play the part of the dementia-riddled victim tomorrow. I would give their corrupt doctor the perfect performance. I would hand them the rope they desperately wanted, and then I would kick the chair right out from under them. The The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows across the polished hardwood floors of my study when the secure encrypted phone line on my desk began to buzz. I sat perfectly still for a moment, adjusting the hidden digital audio recorder pinned inside my thick-knit cardigan. I took a deep breath, centering my mind, and picked up the heavy receiver. It was Arthur Harrington. His voice was completely devoid of its usual pleasantries, operating instead in full corporate warfare mode. He told me we had a massive development. The bait I had handed to my desperate son-in-law had been swallowed whole. Bradley actually went through with the forgery. Arthur explained that his contacts at the county clerk office had just flagged an emergency commercial filing. Bradley and his crooked contact at the downtown escrow office had submitted a rush order property transfer deed right at the opening bell. They took the old irrelevant tax returns I provided, scanned my signature, digitally enhanced it, and slapped it onto a fraudulent bill of sale. They even used a compromised notary seal to make it look entirely legitimate to the naked eye. Bradley was attempting to sell my 4-bedroom home for $600,000 to a shady cash buyer who was eager to flip the property. The buyer was ready to wire the funds by the end of the business day. Bradley was sweating under the immense pressure of his massive cryptocurrency debts and his illegal commercial real estate losses. He was moving so fast he did not even bother to run a thorough secondary title check. If he had done his due diligence, he would have realized the property was already completely locked inside an impenetrable, irrevocable trust. Arthur sounded almost impressed by the sheer stupidity and arrogance of the crime. He told me Bradley was standing in the escrow office right now, pacing the lobby and anxiously waiting for the county clerk to stamp the approval so the buyer could initiate the bank wire. Arthur asked me for the green light to send a cease and desist order immediately. He had a team of aggressive paralegals standing by, ready to freeze the escrow account and notify the local municipal authorities about the forged signature. He told me we could shut Bradley down right this second and have him arrested for basic document fraud before noon. I gripped the heavy mahogany edge of my desk. A cold, relentless calm washed over my entire body. I told Arthur to stand down. I explicitly instructed him to pull his paralegals back and do absolutely nothing to stop the transaction. Arthur paused on the other end of the line. He asked me to repeat my instructions clearly to ensure he understood my legal directive. I told him again to let the fraudulent deed pass through the clerk office without any resistance. I wanted the cash buyer to wire the $600,000 directly into Bradley's offshore shell account. I wanted the transaction to clear every single financial hurdle and officially process. Arthur warned me that allowing the funds to transfer would temporarily complicate the title of my home and create a massive administrative headache. He said it was a highly unorthodox and dangerous legal maneuver. I explained my reasoning with absolute unyielding clarity. I did not want Bradley facing a simple state-level charge for document forgery. A good defense attorney could easily plead that down to probation or a suspended sentence by claiming desperation and first-time offense leniency. That was a simple slap on the wrist. A slap on the wrist was not an acceptable punishment for a man who colluded with the greedy sociopaths who murdered my wife. If we let the bank wire clear, Bradley crosses state and federal banking lines. He commits massive real estate fraud, grand larceny, and federal wire fraud all in one fell swoop. The moment that $600,000 lands in his account, the jurisdiction shifts from local police to the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The mandatory minimum sentencing for those combined federal charges would guarantee Bradley spends at least 15 to 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. There is no early parole in the federal system. I wanted his life entirely destroyed. Arthur remained silent for a long moment, digesting the sheer brutality of my strategy. Then he agreed. He told me he would immediately contact his quiet liaisons at the FBI White-Collar Crime Division. They would monitor the wire transfer in real time, documenting every single digital footprint Bradley left behind. We were going to let him celebrate his fake victory. We were going to let him believe he had outsmarted a senile old man. And then we were going to drop a federal anvil directly on his head. Before Arthur hung up the phone, he cleared his throat. He told me there was one more anomaly his financial monitoring software had caught during the night. It was a secondary breach that occurred just hours before the irrevocable trust fully locked down my Social Security number from the major credit bureaus. My daughter Jasmine had been busy while her husband was forging property deeds. Arthur read the detailed credit report to me. Jasmine had walked into a high-end European auto dealership late yesterday afternoon. Furious about her platinum credit card being declined at the designer boutique, she decided she needed a massive dose of retail therapy to maintain her wealthy socialite facade on social media. She purchased a brand new, fully loaded Porsche SUV, but she did not have the credit score or the verifiable income to secure the luxury vehicle on her own, so she used my personal information. She forged my digital consent online and listed me as the primary co-guarantor on a $120,000 auto loan. The dealership financing department ran the hard credit inquiry just minutes before Arthur's total asset freeze took effect. The loan was approved. Jasmine drove the luxury vehicle right off the lot, believing she had successfully bypassed my frozen bank accounts by opening an entirely new line of credit in my name. She thought she was untouchable. Arthur offered to call the dealership immediately and report the vehicle as stolen by fraud. I smiled a cold, humorless smile. I told him to leave the Porsche alone for now. Jasmine loved parading her fake wealth in front of her friends. I was going to use that exact vanity against her to deliver a public humiliation she would never forget. I hung up the phone and patted the hidden audio recorder on my chest. The financial traps were perfectly set. Now it was time to deal with the fake medical evaluation Kendall was bringing straight to my front door. The doorbell echoed through the quiet house exactly at 10 o'clock. I was already deeply in character. I hunched my shoulders forward, letting my spine curve slightly to mimic the heavy burden of age and profound grief. I shuffled slowly down the hallway, deliberately dragging my slippers across the hardwood floor to create the sound of a frail, defeated man. I reached the front door and unlocked the deadbolt with shaking hands. Kendall stood on my porch. He wore a sharp navy blue suit and a sickeningly confident smirk that he did not even try to hide. Beside him stood a man I had never seen before. He was a short, balding man in a rumpled gray suit clutching a thick, worn leather briefcase. He did not look like a respected medical professional. He looked like a cheap opportunist who sold his ethics to the highest bidder in dark parking lots. "Dad." "I brought someone to see you," Kendall said, pushing past me into the foyer without waiting for an invitation. "This is Dr. Keller. He is a highly respected cognitive specialist. Heather and I thought it would be best to have him come do a simple wellness check right here at the house where you are most comfortable." I blinked rapidly, putting a fearful, confused expression on my face. "A doctor?" I stammered, gripping the edges of my thick-knit cardigan. "I do not need a doctor, Kendall. I am just tired. I want to go sit in my chair and wait for your mother." Dr. Keller stepped inside, wiping his sweaty forehead with a cheap cotton handkerchief. His eyes immediately darted around my expansive living room, taking in the high ceilings, the custom architecture, and the expensive antique furniture. He was not assessing my physical or mental health. He was assessing the sheer wealth he was helping my son steal. "Now, Irving, there is absolutely nothing to worry about," Dr. Keller said, his voice dripping with a practiced, insulting condescension. "We are just going to ask you a few very simple questions. It is entirely painless. Kendall has expressed some deep concerns about your memory slipping since your beautiful wife passed away. We just want to make sure your brain is functioning properly so you can manage your daily life safely." They guided me into the living room and practically forced me to sit on the edge of the sofa. Kendall stood near the fireplace, crossing his arms over his chest like a prison warden overseeing a harsh interrogation. Dr. Keller sat in the armchair opposite me and clicked a silver pen. He pulled a stack of official-looking medical forms from his briefcase. He did not take my blood pressure. He did not check my pulse or look into my eyes with a medical light. He went straight for his clipboard. He was here to provide a paid service, and that service was legally declaring me insane as quickly as possible. I felt the small digital audio recorder resting safely against my chest, completely hidden by the thick folds of my cardigan. The red light was already blinking, recording every single treacherous word spoken in my home. The trap was wide open, and my son was willingly walking the corrupt doctor right into its jaws. Let us start with some basic orientation. Irving, Dr. Keller began, not even bothering to look up from his clipboard. "Can you tell me what year it is right now?" I stared at the coffee table, narrowing my eyes as if I were struggling to grasp a distant, elusive memory. I let the silence stretch for a painfully long time. 1998, I whispered, my voice trembling with artificial uncertainty. "Yes, it is 1998. Diane and I are taking the truck down to Florida next week to visit her sister." I heard Kendall let out a sharp, satisfied breath. "See, doctor," my son said eagerly, stepping closer to the sofa. "He has been doing this all week. He thinks he is still running his old freight company. Yesterday, he completely locked all of his major bank accounts because he forgot his own security passwords. He is a massive danger to his own financial estate. Dr. Keller nodded enthusiastically, scribbling notes on his pad. Very concerning, Kendall. Extremely concerning. This represents a severe detachment from current reality. The doctor turned back to me, pointing his pen at my face. Irving, can you count backwards from 100 by sevens? Just try your best. I furrowed my brow, acting highly distressed by the simple math. 100, I muttered, rubbing my temples. Then 90. Then 85. I cannot do this. My head hurts too much. Why are you making me do numbers? Dr. Keller did not encourage me to try again. He just wrote faster. Irving, can you tell me the name of the current president of the United States? I shook my head slowly, letting a single tear roll down my cheek. I do not know, I mumbled. Why are you asking me these questions? I just want my wife. Where is Diane? Why is she not making my lunch? Kendall crouched down next to me, placing a heavy hand on my knee. His grip was painfully tight, digging into my bone. Mom is dead, Dad. She passed away last week. You cannot even remember that your own wife is buried in the ground. This is exactly why Heather and I need to take over. You cannot survive on your own anymore. You are sick. Dr. Keller did not offer any psychological comfort. He did not suggest grief counseling or trauma therapy. He simply flipped to the final page of his clipboard and signed his name with a dramatic flourish. The cognitive decline is severe and undeniable. Dr. Keller stated, closing his briefcase with a loud snap. I am officially diagnosing him with advanced early-onset dementia complicated by severe trauma-induced psychosis. He lacks the fundamental mental capacity to manage his personal or financial affairs. I will have the formal certificate of incompetence finalized and notarized by this afternoon, Kendall. With this document, a judge will grant you full emergency conservatorship before the courts close tomorrow. Kendall smiled a cold, triumphant grin. He pulled a thick white envelope from his suit jacket pocket and handed it directly to the corrupt doctor. As we agreed, Dr. Keller, Kendall said, his voice low and conspiratorial. $10,000 in cash right now. I will wire the remaining $15,000 to your offshore account the exact second the judge stamps the conservatorship approval and hands me the keys to the estate. Dr. Keller took the envelope, weighing it in his greedy hands. It has been a pleasure doing business with you, Kendall. I kept my head bowed, sobbing quietly into my hands. My performance was flawless. They had just handed me a recorded verbal confession of medical fraud, bribery, and criminal conspiracy. The heavy front door clicked shut behind them. Their hurried footsteps faded down the driveway, followed closely by the sound of Kendall's car engine starting and speeding away. The moment the street fell completely silent, I stopped crying. I wiped my face dry and sat up perfectly straight. The frail, hunched posture vanished instantly, replaced by a rigid iron determination. I reached inside my thick cardigan and unpinned the microscopic digital audio recorder. I looked at the small black device resting in the palm of my hand. It had captured absolutely every single word. The fake diagnosis, the cash bribe, the offshore account promise, and my son's ruthless ambition to strip me of my basic human rights. I walked briskly down the hallway to my secure study and locked the heavy wooden door behind me. I booted up my encrypted laptop and plugged the recorder directly into the USB port. I transferred the pristine audio file onto the hard drive. I listened to the playback, ensuring the voices of Kendall and Dr. Keller were crystal clear. The audio quality was absolutely flawless. Their criminal intent echoed perfectly through my computer speakers. I opened my secure email client and attached the audio file. I drafted an urgent message to Arthur Harrington, instructing him to immediately forward the unedited recording to the State Medical Board, the state licensing authority, and his high-level contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I wanted Dr. Keller stripped of his medical license by sunset. I wanted federal warrants issued for medical fraud and bribery. Kendall thought he was walking into a courtroom tomorrow morning to easily seize my multi-million-dollar fortune. Instead, he was walking directly into a devastating federal indictment. I hit send and watched the progress bar disappear. The medical board would receive the undeniable proof of a corrupt physician selling fraudulent psychiatric evaluations for cash. The FBI would hear my own son orchestrating the complete theft of my estate. The noose was tightening perfectly around their necks, and they still believed they were the ones holding the rope. With the medical board and the FBI now armed with the damning audio of Kendall and the corrupt doctor, I turned my attention to the next parasite on my list, my daughter Jasmine. She had spent her entire adult life curating a flawless, wealthy aesthetic on social media funded entirely by my hard work. Yesterday, she had crossed a massive legal line by forging my digital signature to secure a $120,000 auto loan for a luxury Porsche SUV. She thought she had outsmarted the financial freeze I put in place. She thought she was entitled to leverage my pristine credit score to maintain her extravagant lies. It was time to show her the catastrophic and immediate consequences of identity theft. I picked up the secure line in my study and dialed the direct number to the fraud division of the major auto financing corporation. I did not sound like a confused elderly man. I spoke with the crisp, commanding authority of a former corporate executive who had ruthlessly managed a multi-million-dollar freight empire. I informed the lead fraud investigator that a highly illegal transaction had been processed using my social security number without my physical or digital consent. I provided my strict verification details and immediately submitted the legally binding documents from Mr. Harrington. These documents proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that my entire financial estate was locked inside an irrevocable trust prior to the loan origination. I filed a formal federal affidavit of forgery against my own daughter. The fraud investigator typed furiously on the other end of the line. He informed me that since the primary borrower, Jasmine, had absolutely zero verifiable income or assets to support a six-figure auto loan, the contract was now entirely void. The financing company was not going to send a polite warning letter in the mail. They were immediately flagging the Porsche as a fraudulently acquired asset. I stayed on the line as the investigator dispatched an emergency priority repossession order to a local recovery agency. I hung up the phone and opened my secure banking application. I permanently canceled every single secondary credit card connected to my name. I reported them all as compromised. I wiped out every last financial safety net Jasmine and Heather relied on to fund their fake lives. The digital guillotine fell instantly. Across town, Jasmine was completely oblivious to the legal storm heading straight for her. According to her public social media feed, she was currently holding court at an exclusive upscale bistro in the financial district. She had invited 4 of her most superficial wealthy friends to an expensive outdoor brunch specifically to show off her brand new vehicle. She had aggressively tipped the valet to park the gleaming black Porsche SUV right in front of the restaurant patio, ensuring everyone passing by could admire her fabricated success. She was sitting at a VIP table sipping a $20 mimosa and posing for pictures in her designer sunglasses. She felt like absolute royalty. That fragile illusion shattered perfectly at exactly 1:15 in the afternoon. A massive, heavy-duty diesel tow truck roared down the pristine street, disrupting the quiet, elegant atmosphere of the bistro. It backed up aggressively, stopping mere inches from the front bumper of the Porsche. The hydraulic lift hissed loudly, drawing the immediate attention of every single patron on the patio. A burly repossession agent wearing a high-visibility vest stepped out of the truck holding a heavy metal clipboard. Jasmine dropped her mimosa glass, shattering it against the pavement. She sprinted down the patio steps in her expensive heels, screaming at the top of her lungs. She demanded the tow truck driver step away from her vehicle immediately. She waved her keys in the air, shouting that she had just bought the car yesterday and that he was making a massive illegal mistake. The repossession agent did not even flinch. He calmly checked his vehicle identification number on the dashboard and then looked Jasmine right in the eye. He announced in a booming voice that echoed across the entire crowded patio that the vehicle was being officially repossessed due to severe loan fraud and a forged cosigner affidavit. Jasmine turned chalk white. Her friends who had just been praising her success were now staring at her in absolute horrified silence. Customers at the surrounding tables stopped eating to watch the spectacle. People were pulling out their phones to record the humiliating scene. Jasmine tried to physically block the hydraulic lift, screaming that her father was a millionaire and the bank was just experiencing a technical glitch. The agent simply told her to step back or he would call the police to arrest her for interfering with a lawful recovery of stolen property. She had to stand there completely helpless and utterly humiliated as the heavy steel hooks grabbed the tires of her ultimate status symbol. The truck hoisted the Porsche into the air and drove away, leaving Jasmine stranded on the sidewalk with nothing but the clothes on her back and the mocking stares of the city elite. Her carefully curated social media life was publicly and brutally destroyed. I was sitting in my backyard tending to Diane's rose garden when my cell phone began to vibrate violently in my pocket. I let it ring 5 full times before I calmly pulled off my gardening gloves, picked it up, and pressed accept. Jasmine was hysterical on the other end of the line. She was sobbing so hard she could barely form a coherent sentence. She was hyperventilating, screaming about how the tow truck driver had embarrassed her in front of her most important social circle. She demanded to know why the dealership said my signature was flagged as a federal forgery. She yelled that I had completely ruined her reputation and that she was stranded downtown without a car or a single working credit card to even call a cab. She demanded that I call the bank right this second and clear up the terrible mistake before her friends stopped talking to her forever. I listened to her entire frantic meltdown without interrupting a single time. I let her exhaust her lungs until all she could do was gasp for air. When she finally fell silent, waiting for me to apologize and fix her massive problem, I took a slow, deep breath. I cleared my throat and let my voice become weak, trembling, and incredibly fragile. I leaned perfectly into the exact character they had maliciously created for me. "I am so sorry, sweetie," I whispered, letting out a ragged, artificial sigh. "My mind is just so foggy lately. Your brother and that nice doctor told me I have severe advanced dementia. I must be getting so incredibly senile that I completely forgot to pay the car bill." I pressed the end call button and placed the phone back in my pocket. The silence in my garden was absolutely beautiful. While I was enjoying the quiet peace of my garden, the true storm was making landfall across town. Heather was sitting in her plush leather chair at the suburban bank branch, completely unaware that her pristine corporate life was about to be obliterated. She was irritated by the system lockout on my accounts, but still believed it was just a technical hurdle caused by a confused old man. She was typing a frustrated email to Kendall complaining about my incompetence when two men in dark gray suits stepped into her office. They did not knock. They simply walked in, closed the heavy glass door behind them, and pulled the privacy blinds shut. They were not regional managers or friendly colleagues. They were federal financial auditors accompanied by the bank's chief internal investigator. Heather immediately put on her polished customer service smile, asking how she could help them. The lead auditor did not smile back. He dropped a thick, heavy binder onto her pristine desk. It was an exact printed replica of the files Diane had meticulously gathered on the black USB drive, combined with the comprehensive legal packet Mr. Harrington had overnighted to the bank's corporate fraud division. The investigator calmly instructed Heather to move her hands away from her computer keyboard. He opened the binder and began reciting her crimes with cold, surgical precision. He read aloud the dates, the exact dollar amounts, and the specific administrative override code she had used to bypass the federal security protocols on my retirement accounts. He showed her the digital IP logs, proving she had initiated the unauthorized transfers from her own office terminal. Heather felt the blood completely drain from her face. Her perfectly manicured hands began to shake. She tried to stammer out a desperate defense, claiming I had verbally authorized those transfers for home repairs, and that she was just helping a grieving, confused family member manage his wealth. The auditor cut her off sharply. He presented a sworn affidavit from my attorney proving my assets were now locked in an irrevocable trust. He then highlighted the devastating fact that over $80,000 had been illegally funneled directly into an external shell account registered exclusively in her name. The evidence was absolute, indisputable, and legally bulletproof. There was no gray area and no room for her manipulative gaslighting. The bank had already contacted the federal authorities, and her entire career was officially over. Heather was stripped of her corporate credentials on the spot. The security guard stood over her as she was forced to hand over her keys, her employee badge, and her company phone. She was not allowed to take a single personal belonging from her desk. She was escorted out through the main lobby in broad daylight, marching past her whispering colleagues and confused bank tellers who had respected her just an hour ago. The humiliation was absolute and public. By the time she reached her car in the parking lot, she received an automated notification on her personal cell phone. The bank had initiated an emergency freeze on all her domestic assets to ensure full restitution for the stolen funds. She was financially ruined. Her pristine life was completely destroyed, and she was staring down the barrel of a federal indictment for embezzlement and wire fraud. Heather drove home in a state of absolute hysteria, running red lights and crying uncontrollably. She burst through the front door of her house looking like a deranged stranger. Kendall was sitting in the living room, casually sipping a glass of expensive scotch and reviewing Dr. Keller's fake medical forms. Heather lunged at him with the ferocity of a cornered animal, knocking the crystal glass out of his hand. It shattered against the wall, sending liquor flying everywhere, but she did not care. She screamed at the top of her lungs, her voice cracking with sheer panic. She pounded her fists against his chest, blaming him for orchestrating the entire nightmare. She yelled that my supposedly senile brain had somehow triggered a massive corporate audit that decimated her life. She told him the bank fired her, seized her personal accounts, and that federal agents would be knocking on their door any minute to arrest her. She shrieked that she was not going to spend 10 years in a federal penitentiary for a plan he had forced her into. Kendall grabbed her by the shoulders, pinning her arms down to stop her from hitting him. His confident, arrogant facade instantly crumbled as the horrific reality of her words sank into his mind. Kendall stared at his frantic wife, his mind racing to process the catastrophic collapse of their financial lifeline. He realized the bank lockdown was not a simple password error made by a grieving widower, but his sheer arrogance and blinding pride prevented him from seeing the full truth. He still refused to believe I was a tactical threat who had orchestrated this entire takedown. He convinced himself that Diane must have left a paper trail before she died, and the bank simply caught the discrepancies during a routine automated estate review. He truly believed I was still just a weak, vulnerable old man sitting alone in a big empty house, completely unaware of the chaos unfolding. Kendall knew their window of opportunity was slamming shut rapidly. With Heather facing imminent federal charges and their accounts frozen, they were completely out of time and out of money. He pushed Heather away and snatched the fraudulent medical certificate off the floor where it had fallen. His eyes were wild with a dark, cornered desperation. He told her to pack a bag immediately and shut her mouth before the neighbors called the police. He declared they were no longer waiting for a judge to grant a formal legal conservatorship next week. The standard legal route was taking too long. They were going to use the absolute nuclear option today. He looked at the forged diagnosis of advanced psychosis and severe dementia signed by their corrupt doctor. Kendall stated that with this specific piece of paper, they had the immediate legal authority to initiate an involuntary emergency psychiatric hold. He was going to bypass the courts entirely. He told Heather he was calling a private medical transport company right now. They were going to drive a specialized ambulance directly to my front door, drag me out of my own home, and lock me inside a high-security psychiatric nursing facility by sunset. Once I was committed as a danger to myself, he would automatically gain emergency medical control to liquidate the house and pay off whoever he needed to make the criminal charges disappear. Kendall grabbed his coat, his eyes burning with absolute ruthless desperation. He thought he was about to deliver the final lethal blow to his helpless father. He had no idea he was walking straight into the ultimate execution chamber I had spent the last 48 hours building. While Kendall was frantically organizing a fake medical transport to drag me out of my home, Bradley was standing in a sleek, glass-walled conference room in the heart of the downtown financial district. He was sweating through his expensive tailored suit. His phone buzzed relentlessly in his pocket. It was not his wife calling to complain about her repossessed car. It was his offshore crypto creditors. They were not sending polite payment reminders. They were sending him pictures of his own front door accompanied by strict deadlines that expired by the end of the business day. Bradley was completely cornered. His reckless gambling on commercial real estate and digital currency had dug a $600,000 hole, and the people he owed money to did not negotiate. But as he stood at the polished mahogany table of the premier title and escrow agency, he believed he had just found his ultimate salvation. He believed he was the smartest man in the room. Bradley smoothed his silk tie and handed a thick manila envelope to the senior escrow officer. Inside was the fraudulent property deed he had paid $10,000 to fabricate. It featured my digitally enhanced signature, a backdated timeline, and a completely fake notary seal. It looked absolutely perfect to the untrained eye. He also handed over the wiring instructions for his private offshore shell account. The cash buyer, a ruthless property flipper, had already deposited the $600,000 into the escrow holding account. All that remained was for the officer to verify the deed, stamp the approval, and initiate the final wire transfer. Bradley paced the length of the conference room, checking his heavy gold watch every 10 seconds. He convinced himself that my mind was so far gone I would not even notice I no longer owned the home I was sleeping in. He planned to use the cash to pay off the violent loan sharks, clear his commercial debts, and pocket the remaining $100,000 to fund his next reckless venture. The escrow officer, a stern woman in her 50s, carefully reviewed the paperwork. She typed rapidly on her keyboard, her eyes darting between the fraudulent deed and her dual computer monitors. Bradley held his breath. He offered his most charming, charismatic real estate broker smile, trying to project an aura of absolute professional confidence. He made a casual joke about how difficult it was managing the estate of a senile father-in-law. The officer did not laugh. She did not even look up. She simply pressed the enter key on her keyboard and stated that the wire transfer had been officially initiated and the funds were now in transit across state lines. Bradley let out a massive, trembling sigh of relief. He felt a euphoric rush of adrenaline. He had done it. He had stolen my home, committed massive document forgery, and secured his financial rescue, all without breaking a sweat. He reached out to shake the escrow officer's hand, ready to walk out of the building a free and wealthy man. He never even got the chance to touch her hand. The heavy glass doors of the conference room did not just open. They were violently shoved apart. 6 men wearing tactical windbreakers emblazoned with the bright yellow letters of the Federal Bureau of Investigation swarmed into the room. They moved with terrifying speed and absolute precision. Bradley stumbled backward, hitting the edge of the conference table, his charismatic smile vanishing instantly. The lead federal agent did not ask for his identification. He did not ask him to sit down. He grabbed Bradley by the shoulder, spun him around, and slammed him face first against the polished mahogany table. The sound of heavy steel handcuffs ratcheting tightly around Bradley's wrists echoed sharply through the glass room. Bradley began to hyperventilate, screaming that there was a massive mistake. He yelled that he was a licensed commercial real estate broker and that he was conducting a lawful family estate transaction. He demanded they release him immediately. The lead FBI agent ignored his frantic protests. He pulled a printed document from his jacket and read it directly into Bradley's ear. He informed him that the moment the wire transfer crossed federal banking lines, he had officially committed grand larceny, wire fraud, and interstate financial crimes. The agent then explained that the property deed he submitted was an illegal forgery and the home he attempted to sell was legally shielded by an irrevocable trust registered to Arthur Harrington. At the mention of my lawyer's name, Bradley stopped struggling. The blood drained entirely from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. He slowly turned his head toward the open doorway. Standing perfectly still in the lobby, flanked by 2 federal prosecutors, was Arthur Harrington. My attorney adjusted his tailored jacket and looked at Bradley with a cold, predatory stare. Arthur stepped into the doorway and delivered the final crushing blow. He told Bradley that the escrow officer had been cooperating with federal authorities since yesterday morning. I had personally authorized the wire transfer to clear specifically to trigger the mandatory minimum federal sentencing guidelines. Arthur informed him he was looking at 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary without the possibility of early parole. Bradley's knees gave out. The federal agents had to physically hold him upright as they dragged him out of the conference room and marched him through the crowded lobby. They shoved Bradley into the back of an armored federal transport vehicle. As a standard procedural courtesy before arriving at the federal holding facility, the lead agent allowed him exactly 1 monitored phone call. Bradley sat in the dark, cramped back seat, his hands cuffed behind his back, awkwardly holding the agent's cell phone to his ear on speaker. He dialed Jasmine. He expected her to answer from her luxurious brunch to help him secure a high-powered defense attorney. Instead, Jasmine answered the phone, screaming hysterically. She was standing on a busy downtown sidewalk, sobbing about how her brand-new Porsche had just been brutally repossessed in front of her entire social circle. She shrieked that her platinum cards were declining and her life was completely ruined. Bradley interrupted her frantic crying, his voice hollow and dead. He told her the FBI just arrested him for federal wire fraud. He told her there was no money left and that her father was not a senile old man. He told her that Irving had orchestrated an elaborate legal trap and they had walked right into a federal sting operation. Jasmine stopped screaming. A horrifying, suffocating silence fell over the phone line as the catastrophic reality finally hit her. They were completely bankrupt, publicly humiliated, and facing decades in prison. Their entire malicious empire had collapsed in less than 4 hours. Jasmine hung up the phone and desperately tried to call her brother. But Kendall was not answering his phone. Kendall was currently sitting in the passenger seat of a private medical transport van speeding towards my house with a fake psychiatric diagnosis. He was completely unaware that the money was gone, his sister was stranded, and his brother-in-law was in federal custody. Kendall thought he was arriving to deliver my final defeat. He had no idea he was driving straight into a heavily guarded execution chamber. The heavy rumble of a diesel engine shattered the quiet sanctuary of my neighborhood. I stood in my foyer, looking through the sheer curtains of the front window. A large, white private medical transport van backed aggressively into my driveway. The bright amber emergency lights flashed relentlessly, reflecting off the polished hardwood floors of my home. Kendall stepped out of the passenger side, slamming the door with immense force. He marched toward my porch with the confident, aggressive stride of a man who believed he was about to conquer the world. Right behind him emerged Heather. She looked absolutely unhinged. Her designer trench coat was wrinkled, her hair was disheveled, and her expensive makeup was smeared around her eyes. She had just fled the devastating federal audit at her bank, and she was clinging to Kendall's ruthless plan as her singular lifeline. Two massive orderlies dressed in crisp white uniforms stepped out of the back of the van. They carried heavy canvas restraints and a collapsible medical wheelchair. They looked less like healthcare professionals and more like hired muscle. Before Kendall could even raise his fist to pound on the wood, I unhooked the deadbolt and pulled the front door open. Kendall shoved his way inside, waving the fraudulent psychiatric diagnosis right in my face. He did not waste time with fake pleasantries. He told me the game was completely over. He declared that he had the ultimate legal authority to commit me to a high-security psychiatric lockdown facility right this very second. He pointed a stiff finger at my chest, threatening that if I did not walk out to that van peacefully, the orderlies would physically tackle me, strap me to the chair, and drag me out in front of the entire neighborhood. Heather stepped around him, her eyes wild with a manic, desperate energy. She screamed that I had ruined her pristine life, that I had somehow triggered the corporate auditors, and that she was going to make sure I rotted in a padded room until I forgot my own name. I backed away slowly, letting my hands tremble violently. I looked at the two large men stepping into my foyer. The physical threat was entirely real. Kendall had purchased a fake diagnosis, and he was entirely willing to use brute force to remove me from my own property. I needed to pivot the situation instantly before they put their hands on me. I held up my shaking hands in a gesture of total, absolute surrender. I let out a long, heavy sigh and let my shoulders slump forward, projecting the image of a completely defeated, broken man. I looked Kendall in the eyes and told him he had won. I whispered that I was simply too tired to fight him anymore, and if he truly believed I belonged in a medical facility, I would pack a small bag and go quietly. Kendall smirked, a dark, victorious grin spreading across his face. He turned to signal the orderlies to bring the wheelchair inside. But before the men could step forward, I looked up with a perfectly crafted expression of tragic resignation. I told Kendall there was just one final critical piece of business we must conclude before I was legally committed to the state. I turned and walked slowly toward my mahogany desk in the study. Kendall and Heather followed closely behind me, their suspicion warring with their impatience. I opened the heavy bottom drawer of my desk and pulled out a thick-bound stack of embossed financial certificates. I placed them gently onto the leather blotter. I told Kendall that while he was busy locking down the standard banking accounts and Heather was monitoring the retirement funds, they had entirely missed my private offshore brokerage portfolio. I explained with crystal-clear articulation that I held exactly $5 million in unrestricted blue-chip stocks and bearer bonds. I emphasized that these assets were solely in my name, completely separate from the irrevocable trust I had recently established. I told them I had planned to distribute these exact shares equally among my children this very afternoon as an early inheritance to clear my conscience. I let the massive monetary figure hang in the silent room. Then I delivered the killing blow. I explained that the exact moment I stepped into that ambulance and was officially declared mentally incompetent by a judge, those $5 million would be instantly frozen by the federal probate courts. A state-appointed guardian would seize the entire portfolio, and it would take a decade of grueling, expensive litigation for them to see a single dime. But I offered them an immediate alternative. I told Kendall that my mind was perfectly clear right now. I told him I was willing to sign the unconditional transfer deeds right here on this desk, turning the entire $5 million fortune over to him, Jasmine and Heather, completely tax-free. But I insisted it must be done as a formal family meeting with everyone present so there could be no legal disputes later. I told them I just needed 1 hour to read my final declarations and sign the papers before the ambulance took me away forever. The transformation in Kendall and Heather was absolute and instantaneous. The sheer mention of $5 million liquid dollars entirely paralyzed their rational thought. Heather stared at the embossed certificates with wide, ravenous eyes. $5 million would not just pay off her impending legal fines, it would guarantee her a life of unimaginable luxury even after her catastrophic banking scandal. Kendall did the rapid mental math in his head. He realized that a 1-hour delay would not invalidate the fraudulent medical certificate tucked safely in his breast pocket. His blinding arrogance and insatiable greed completely overrode his basic common sense. He turned to the orderlies standing in the hallway and handed them a thick stack of $100 bills. He instructed them to wait outside in the transport van with the engine running. He told them he needed exactly 1 hour to finalize some critical family estate business before initiating the transport. The moment the heavy front door clicked shut behind the medical staff, Kendall pulled out his cell phone. He frantically dialed Jasmine's number. He did not know she was currently standing on a downtown sidewalk crying over her repossessed vehicle and a husband in federal custody. When she answered, he did not even let her speak. He simply commanded her to hail a cab and get to my house immediately, because I was about to sign over $5 million in liquid assets. He hung up the phone and turned to me with a predatory, triumphant smile. He told me to get the specialty pens ready. He believed he had brilliantly checkmated me. He had absolutely no idea he had just eagerly locked the doors to his own execution chamber. 30 minutes later, a yellow taxi skidded to a violent halt at the end of my driveway. Jasmine practically fell out of the back seat, leaving the door wide open behind her. She looked like an absolute disaster. Her designer sunglasses were missing, her expensive silk blouse was stained with nervous sweat, and her flawless makeup was completely ruined by her public meltdown downtown. She sprinted up the concrete walkway, completely ignoring the white medical transport van idling by the curb with its amber lights flashing. She burst through the front door, gasping for air, her eyes frantic and wild. Kendall and Heather were already waiting in the formal dining room. They had taken seats at the long, polished mahogany table, acting as though this were a standard corporate board meeting instead of a hostile takeover of my entire life. Jasmine stumbled into the room and collapsed into a high-backed leather chair. She did not ask how I was feeling. She did not mention her repossessed Porsche or the fact that Bradley was currently sitting in a federal holding cell. The blinding promise of a $5 million payday had temporarily erased her catastrophic reality. She believed this money was her ultimate salvation, her get-out-of-jail-free card that would magically fix her shattered social standing and erase all her debts. The atmosphere in the room was a sickening cocktail of artificial warmth and ravenous, unapologetic greed. Kendall leaned forward, resting his elbows on the polished wood, offering me a smile so intensely fake it made my skin crawl. He asked if I was comfortable. He offered to fetch me a glass of water, acting like the devoted son deeply concerned for his fragile father. Heather sat rigidly beside him, desperately trying to maintain her polished banking executive persona despite her recent devastating firing. She smoothed out the wrinkles in her trench coat and nodded along with Kendall, forcing a sweet, gentle tone into her voice. She told me how brave I was being and how this massive financial transfer would ensure I received the absolute best psychiatric care money could buy once the ambulance took me away. They were practically vibrating with eager anticipation. Their eyes kept darting aggressively to the thick stack of embossed certificates I had placed precisely in the center of the table. They believed they had successfully cornered me. They thought my spirit was entirely broken and that I was buying my own peace by handing over the keys to the kingdom. I sat at the head of the table, keeping my posture slightly stooped, letting my hands rest weakly on the armrests of my chair. I played the role of the defeated patriarch, giving them exactly the illusion of absolute control they craved. I watched them count their unearned millions in their heads, completely blind to the reality of the room. I slowly lifted my gaze from the table and looked past my 3 greedy children. My eyes settled on the large silver-framed photograph resting on the stone mantelpiece above the fireplace. It was a picture of Diane taken just 2 years ago during our anniversary trip to the coast. She was smiling that bright, knowing smile that always reached her eyes. Looking at her beautiful face, a flood of vivid memories anchored me to this exact room. I remembered the weekend she insisted on painting these dining room walls a warm shade of ivory. I remembered her standing on a step stool laughing out loud as she hung the heavy velvet curtains that currently draped the windows. She built this home with her bare hands, her endless patience, and her unwavering love. Diane had poured her entire soul into raising Kendall and Jasmine, believing she was nurturing a legacy of honor, integrity, and compassion. As a nurse, she spent 30 years saving the lives of complete strangers, working grueling night shifts to ensure other families did not have to suffer loss. Instead, she had nurtured cold-blooded parasites who would not even save her. I thought about the hidden audio file safely locked away in my study. I thought about her final days lying in that sterile hospital bed, suffocating in a pharmaceutical fog because my own son and daughter-in-law decided her medical treatments were a bad return on their financial investment. They had literally calculated the monetary cost of her life and decided she was simply too expensive to keep breathing. A profound, chilling calm settled over my mind, erasing any lingering doubts. Any remaining trace of paternal hesitation evaporated, leaving behind a hardened core of absolute, unyielding justice. I was not doing this out of spite or simple financial self-defense anymore. I was executing a righteous vengeance for the woman who deserved to grow old with me. I mentally spoke to the photograph on the mantel. I promised her that the people who desecrated our home and stole her future were about to pay the ultimate price. I stared at Diane's face and drew an immense, unshakable strength from her memory. This was no longer a negotiation over money. It was an execution for murder. I breathed in deeply, feeling the presence of my late wife standing right beside me, ready to watch the gavel fall. I shifted my gaze from the mantelpiece to the heavy double doors leading directly into my private study. To Kendall, Jasmine, and Heather, the doors simply looked securely shut, blocking off the rest of the house so we could conduct our private family business in peace. They had absolutely no idea what was waiting for them on the other side of that solid oak wood. Earlier this morning, while Kendall was busy bribing a corrupt physician and Heather was facing federal auditors, I had quietly unlocked the side entrance of my home. Mr. Harrington had not come alone. Standing in perfect silence inside my study was my ruthless attorney, accompanied by a heavily armed team of elite law enforcement officials. 2 senior financial investigators from the State Banking Commission were currently reviewing Heather's printed embezzlement files. 2 plainclothes detectives from the Major Crimes Unit were holding the transcribed copies of the medical homicide recordings containing the undeniable proof of Diane's murder. And standing closest to the door were the exact same federal agents who had just arrested Bradley for real estate fraud a few hours ago. They had positioned themselves perfectly in the shadows. The digital audio recorder I had pinned inside my cardigan was actively transmitting a crystal-clear live feed directly to a secure receiver on Mr. Harrington's desk. Every single lie, every fake pleasantry, and every admission of guilt my children spoke in this dining room was being broadcast directly to the men and women holding their federal arrest warrants. The trap was not just set. The steel jaws were already snapping shut around their ankles. I slowly reached out and pulled the stack of certificates closer to me, preparing to deliver the final lethal blow. Kendall could no longer contain his ravenous impatience. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a thick silver fountain pen. He slid it across the polished mahogany table, stopping right in front of my hands. Then he pulled out a heavily stapled legal document from his leather briefcase. It was not just a simple transfer deed. It was a comprehensive, irrevocable power of attorney specifically designed to bypass any probate court delays and grant him immediate total control over my life. He smoothed the paper flat, tapping his manicured index finger aggressively on the signature line. "Dad, we need to make this official right now," Kendall urged, his voice trembling with an eagerness he could no longer mask. "The medical transport team is waiting outside and they are on a very strict schedule. If we do not sign these asset transfers immediately, the state-appointed guardians will seize the entire $5 million portfolio by sunset. You know how slow the government is. It will be tied up in bureaucratic red tape for decades, and you will have nothing left to pay for your daily care." Heather nodded vigorously, leaning so far forward she was almost hovering over the center of the table. "Kendall is absolutely right, Irving. As a former bank manager, I have seen this happen 100 times. The state will drain your wealth through endless administrative fees. We are your family. We are the only ones who can protect this money for you. Just sign the papers, and we will ensure you live in absolute luxury at the care facility." Jasmine shifted frantically in her leather chair, her eyes darting between the silver pen and the stack of certificates. "Please, Dad, just do it," she begged, her voice cracking with raw desperation. "I need this money today. You do not understand the kind of trouble I am in downtown. My car is gone. My friends are laughing at me. If you really love us, you will sign those papers and save us from this nightmare." The sheer audacity of their performance was breathtaking. They were staring at me like starving wolves circling a wounded animal. They truly believed they had successfully manipulated a broken, senile old man into handing over his life's work. They were so blinded by the glowing promise of $5 million, they did not even bother to read the room. They did not notice that my hands had completely stopped shaking. They did not realize that the frail, hunched posture I had maintained for 2 days had entirely vanished. I sat up perfectly straight in my chair, squaring my broad shoulders. I looked at the silver pen resting on the table. I did not reach for it. Instead, I slowly reached down beneath the edge of the dining table where I had hidden a very specific item before they arrived. I lifted the faded vintage yellow cookie tin and placed it dead center on the polished mahogany table directly on top of Kendall's fraudulent legal documents. The heavy metallic clunk echoed sharply through the quiet dining room. Kendall frowned, staring at the battered tin box with deep confusion. "What is this, Dad?" he asked, his tone dripping with sudden irritation. "We do not have time for old sentimental memories right now. The ambulance is idling outside. We have to finish this paperwork." I ignored him entirely. I popped the tight lid off the tin. I did not pull out old photographs or letters. I reached inside and retrieved the cheap prepaid burner phone Diane had hidden for me. Alongside it, I pulled out a small, high-definition Bluetooth speaker I had connected earlier. I set the speaker on the table and powered it on. A soft blue light illuminated the center of the room. Heather stared at this device as her polished banking executive facade cracking with a sudden, inexplicable sense of dread. "Irving, what are you doing?" she demanded, her voice rising an octave in panic. "I told you I am not a confused old man," I stated, my voice resonating with cold, thunderous clarity. "I am a man who finally listens to his wife." I tapped the screen of the burner phone, unlocking the audio file Diane had meticulously intercepted and recorded during her final days in the oncology ward. I pressed play and maximized the volume. The silence in the room was instantly shattered by the crisp digital recording. First came the voice of Dr. Aris explaining the highly optimistic 80% success rate of the experimental immunotherapy treatment that could have saved Diane's life. Then Kendall's own voice boomed through the speaker system, echoing off the ivory walls. "That is absurd. My mother is nearly 70 years old. Putting her through a grueling experimental trial is just cruel. We are not going to waste $100,000 on false hope." Heather's recorded voice immediately followed, backing up her husband with ruthless corporate efficiency. "We cannot drain Irving's retirement savings on a long shot. He needs that money for his own future care. We are choosing comfort care for Diane from here on out." The audio then played the most damning part of the entire conversation. Heather bragging to Kendall about slipping the night shift nurse a cash bribe in a white envelope to maximize the morphine dosage around the clock. She proudly admitted they were deliberately keeping Diane heavily sedated so she would sleep right through to the end, preventing her from ever speaking to me about the stolen bank accounts. I let the recording play until the final sickening click of the call ending. The heavy, oppressive silence slammed back down on the dining room. I did not turn the speaker off. I left the blue light glowing in the center of the table, illuminating the horrifying truth of their ultimate crime. The atmosphere in the dining room instantly plunged to absolute zero. The air grew so incredibly thick and heavy it felt impossible to breathe. The arrogant, confident smirks were violently ripped from my children's faces. Kendall sat entirely paralyzed in his chair. The blood completely drained from his face, leaving his skin the color of dirty ash. He stared at the blue speaker as if it were a venomous snake coiled on the table. His mouth opened and closed silently, but no words came out. The realization of what he had just heard was short-circuiting his brain. Heather looked as though she had been physically struck by a speeding freight train. She pressed her trembling hands tightly over her mouth, her eyes wide with pure, unadulterated terror. She knew exactly what that recording meant. It was not just proof of financial theft. It was an undeniable recorded confession to medical homicide and federal bribery. Jasmine, who had been entirely focused on paying off her repossessed luxury vehicle, slowly turned her head to look at her brother. The sheer horror dawning on her face proved she had been completely unaware of the murderous lengths Kendall and Heather had gone to secure the inheritance. She pushed her chair back, scraping the legs loudly against the hardwood floor, trying to physically distance herself from the two monsters sitting next to her. The invincible predatory confidence that had fueled them for the past 48 hours shattered into a million irreparable pieces. They were no longer the apex predators hunting a weak old man. They were trapped prey, realizing the cage doors had been locked the entire time. Kendall finally managed to swallow hard, his throat bobbing visibly. "Dad," he croaked, his voice a pathetic, terrified whisper. "Where did you get that?" I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the table, my eyes locking onto his with a gaze as cold as a graveyard. "Your mother left it for me," I replied evenly. And she was not the only one listening today. The solid oak double doors of my private study unlatched with a heavy, deliberate click. The sound was deafening in the frozen silence of the dining room. Kendall, Heather, and Jasmine snapped their heads toward the noise, their eyes widening in absolute terror. They watched in paralyzed disbelief as the heavy doors swung open to reveal the army I had silently assembled. Arthur Harrington stepped into the light first, looking like a grim executioner in his tailored charcoal suit. Behind him marched the 2 State Banking Commission investigators and the 2 plainclothes detectives from the Major Crimes Unit. But the final arrival was the most devastating. The federal agents who had executed the sting operation downtown stepped out of the shadows, forcefully guiding a handcuffed and completely broken Bradley into the dining room. They had transported my disgraced son-in-law directly from his federal holding cell to ensure every single conspirator was present for the total collapse of their malicious empire. Bradley looked like a hollowed-out ghost of his former arrogant self. His expensive suit was rumpled, his tie was missing, and his wrists were bound tightly in heavy steel chains. When Jasmine saw her husband being paraded into her childhood home by federal agents, she let out a strangled, horrified gasp, pressing her hands against her pale cheeks. Kendall and Heather remained glued to their leather chairs, completely surrounded by the overwhelming presence of state and federal law enforcement. They had walked into a meticulously designed slaughterhouse. I stood up from the head of the table, my posture straight and commanding. I reached out as Mr. Harrington stepped forward and handed me 3 thick, heavy legal folders. I raised them high so my children could see exactly what I was holding. I slammed the first folder onto the polished mahogany table right next to the glowing blue speaker. I announced that this was the comprehensive financial audit proving Heather had systematically embezzled over $80,000 from my retirement accounts using her executive banking override codes. Heather flinched violently as if the folder itself had burned her. I slammed the second folder down. I stated clearly that this contained the fraudulent property deed Bradley had forged this morning along with the undeniable proof of his illegal offshore wire transfer. Bradley closed his eyes and hung his head in absolute shame. Finally, I slammed the third and thickest folder onto the table. I looked directly into Kendall's panicked eyes and declared that this was the sworn statement from the corrupt doctor he had bribed just hours ago, along with the undeniable audio evidence of their medical homicide. The truth was completely laid bare on the mahogany wood. There were no more lies to spin and no more shadows to hide within. The lead detective from the Major Crimes Unit stepped forward. He looked at Kendall and Heather with absolute disgust. He formally announced that they were both under arrest for the premeditated murder of Diane, the forgery of medical documents, and severe elder financial abuse. The sheer reality of the word murder hanging in the air broke whatever fragile psychological dam was keeping my children together. The invincible alliance they had formed to steal my wealth instantly vaporized. Heather was the first to completely crack. Her polished banking facade shattered into a million jagged pieces. She leaped out of her chair, backing away from her husband as if he were covered in a deadly disease. She pointed a violently shaking finger directly at Kendall's chest. She screamed at the detectives that it was all his idea. She shrieked that she never wanted to kill anyone and that Kendall had aggressively forced her to confront Dr. Aris. She sobbed hysterically, claiming Kendall had manipulated her into bribing the night shift nurse because he was terrified of losing his inheritance. She threw the man she had sworn to love completely under the bus, begging the officers for leniency and offering to testify against him in federal court to save herself. Kendall roared with sheer outraged fury. He lunged toward Heather but was immediately intercepted by a plainclothes detective who shoved him hard against the dining table. Kendall spat venom at his wife, calling her a greedy, pathological liar. He screamed that she was the one who initially stole from my retirement accounts to fund her extravagant wardrobe, and that she was the one who personally handed the cash envelope to the corrupt nurse. They tore into each other like starving feral rats trapped in a sinking cage, showing absolutely no loyalty, no love, and no honor. They were exposing their cowardly, pathetic true nature right in front of the police. Watching his wife and brother-in-law cannibalize each other, Bradley suddenly snapped. He strained against the grip of the federal agents and turned his furious, bloodshot eyes toward Jasmine. He began to scream at the top of his lungs, his voice cracking with unhinged rage. He blamed Jasmine for his entire downfall. He yelled that her relentless psychotic obsession with social media, her refusal to get a real job, and her endless demands for luxury had driven him straight into the hands of violent loan sharks. He cursed her fake platinum lifestyle, stating he only forged the property deed because she was bankrupting him faster than he could breathe. Jasmine shrieked right back at him, calling him a pathetic loser, a failed broker, and a spineless coward who could not even provide for his own family. The dining room devolved into an absolute cacophony of vicious screaming, crying, and merciless betrayal. I stood at the head of the table watching them tear each other to shreds with a cold, detached satisfaction. They were doing exactly what parasites do when the host finally cuts off the food supply. The lead detective had heard enough of their pathetic squabbling. He barked a harsh, loud command that instantly silenced the room. He ordered his officers to restrain the suspects. The sharp, metallic ratcheting sound of heavy steel handcuffs filled the air. Two detectives grabbed Kendall, twisting his arms roughly behind his back and snapping the cuffs onto his wrists. A female officer did the same to Heather, ignoring her loud, desperate pleas for mercy. The federal agents tightened their grip on Bradley, preparing to drag him back to the transport vehicle. The officers began to read the Miranda rights in a synchronized, overlapping chorus that sounded like a death knell for their freedom. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. The heavy, authoritative words washed over the dining room, cementing the absolute finality of their destruction. Kendall, Heather, and Bradley were forcefully yanked to their feet. Their designer clothes were rumpled, their faces were stained with tears of sheer panic, and their arrogant pride was entirely extinguished. I watched as the detectives began to march them toward the foyer. The fake private medical transport van that Kendall had hired was still idling out on the curb, waiting to lock me away in a psychiatric ward. But now that pristine white van was completely surrounded by a fleet of flashing blue and red police cruisers. The entire neighborhood had gathered on the sidewalks, drawn by the flashing lights and the commotion. My children were about to be paraded out of my front door in heavy steel chains. The long walk to the police cruisers would be the longest, most humiliating walk of their entire pathetic lives. I followed them slowly into the hallway, ready to watch the heavy doors of justice slam permanently shut behind them. The detectives shoved the heavy double doors of my study wide open and marched my children into the main hallway. The crisp afternoon air rushed into the foyer, but it was immediately overwhelmed by the chaotic flashing of red and blue emergency lights. My pristine suburban street had been completely transformed into a massive, heavily coordinated crime scene. 5 local police cruisers and 2 unmarked federal black SUVs had established a solid perimeter blocking the exits of the cul-de-sac. Right in the middle of this barricade sat the white private medical transport van Kendall had hired to lock me away. The orderlies who were supposed to drag me out in a straitjacket were now standing on the curb with their hands raised, giving their statements to uniformed officers. They looked terrified, eager to distance themselves from Kendall's fraudulent medical conspiracy. Word travels fast in a quiet, upscale neighborhood. The relentless wailing of the arriving police sirens had drawn every single resident out of their homes. Dozens of neighbors were gathered on the sidewalks, their arms crossed and their cell phones held high. They were recording every single humiliating second of this unprecedented spectacle. Mrs. Gable from across the street was standing on her pristine lawn with her hand over her mouth in absolute shock. Mr. Henderson, the retired judge who lived next door, was shaking his head in sheer disgust. They had all known Diane. They had all respected our family for decades. Now they were witnessing the absolute destruction of my children's carefully curated, high society facade. The detectives marched Heather out first. The sharp, cold sunlight hit her tear-stained face, exposing her completely ruined makeup. Her expensive beige designer trench coat hung awkwardly off her shoulders as her hands were pinned forcefully behind her back in heavy steel handcuffs. She tried to duck her head, trying to hide her face behind her messy blonde hair, but it was entirely useless. The digital cameras of her wealthy neighbors captured every sob and every frantic plea for mercy. She was no longer the polished, arrogant banking executive who looked down on everyone. She was a disgraced embezzler doing the public perp walk in broad daylight. The federal agents brought Bradley out next. The contrast was absolutely stunning. This was the arrogant real estate broker who loved to boast about his cryptocurrency portfolios and massive commercial properties at neighborhood barbecues. Now he walked with a severe limp, his shoulders slumped, his eyes firmly glued to the concrete driveway. He looked absolutely pathetic. The heavy federal chains clinking around his wrists echoed loudly in the quiet street, providing a rhythmic, terrifying soundtrack to his total downfall. Jasmine stood frozen on my front porch, watching her husband being paraded like a common thief. She was not in handcuffs, but her punishment was equally severe. She had no luxury car, no money, no credit cards, and a husband facing decades in federal prison. She was entirely bankrupt, stripped of her fake social media identity, and publicly ruined. Finally, the lead detective marched Kendall through the front door. My eldest son, the mastermind behind this entire murderous conspiracy, stumbled over the threshold. The neighbors immediately began whispering, pointing their phone cameras directly at his face. Kendall tried to maintain his arrogant posture, but his knees visibly buckled when he saw the sheer scale of the police presence waiting for him. The neighborhood he had wanted to conquer and impress was now the silent, captive audience to his ultimate execution. As the lead detective guided Kendall toward the back seat of a waiting police cruiser, the catastrophic reality of his permanent destruction finally shattered his ego. He stopped walking. He dug the heels of his expensive Italian leather shoes into the concrete driveway, refusing to move another inch. The detective yanked his arm hard, but Kendall twisted his body around, frantically searching the porch until his desperate, terrified eyes locked onto mine. "Dad!" he screamed, his voice cracking with a raw, pathetic terror that echoed down the entire street. "Dad, please, you have to stop this. Tell them it is a massive mistake. I am your son. You cannot do this to your own flesh and blood. You cannot send your own son to die in a prison cell. I will give the money back. I will do whatever you want." I walked slowly to the edge of the front porch. Mr. Harrington stood silently behind me, a grim witness to the final judgment. I looked down at Kendall from the elevated concrete steps towering over his pathetic begging form. The whispering crowd of neighbors fell completely silent, waiting for my response. I did not raise my voice. I did not yell. I spoke with a chilling, absolute calm that carried perfectly through the crisp afternoon air. "I am not sending my son to prison, Kendall." I stated, my voice as cold and unforgiving as the steel cuffs binding his wrists. "The son I raised died the very second you put a financial price tag on your mother's life. You traded your own flesh and blood for a bank balance. You bribed a hospital worker to drug the woman who gave you life, and you let her suffocate in a medical bed because her treatments were cutting into your inheritance." The neighbors gasped collectively. The horrifying truth of Diane's murder was now public knowledge. Kendall began to openly weep, shaking his head frantically side to side as the crushing weight of public condemnation slammed into him. "Dad, I am so sorry." He sobbed, his arrogant pride completely obliterated. "Please remember Mom. She loved us. She would not want our family destroyed like this. Do it for her. I am begging you." My jaw clenched. The absolute blinding audacity of him invoking Diane's name ignited a final righteous fury inside my chest. I looked at the pathetic, trembling man who had stolen my wife's final years. "I did do this for her," I replied, my tone completely devoid of mercy or hesitation. "You are nothing to me but the man who murdered my wife. From this exact second forward, you have no father. You have no family, you are a parasite, and you are completely alone." Kendall's knees completely gave out. He collapsed against the side of the police cruiser, letting out a guttural, agonizing wail of pure despair. There was no more psychological manipulation left to deploy. There were no more lies he could spin to save himself. The lead detective showed zero compassion for his tears. He grabbed Kendall firmly by the shoulders, pushed his head down, and shoved him roughly into the cramped back seat of the squad car. The heavy reinforced door slammed shut with a sharp, violently loud metallic crash. That single decisive sound signaled the absolute permanent end of Kendall's freedom. Across the driveway, the federal agents loaded Bradley into the back of their armored black SUV, securing him behind a thick steel cage. Another officer shoved Heather into a separate police vehicle, ignoring her endless frantic apologies. One by one, the heavy car doors slammed shut, sealing their fates and separating them forever. The convoy of police cruisers and federal transports roared to life. Their sirens wailed in unison, drowning out the fading sounds of Heather's crying. The vehicles rolled down the street and disappeared around the corner, leaving behind nothing but the quiet hum of the suburban neighborhood and the faint smell of engine exhaust. I stood on my porch looking at the empty driveway. I took a long, deep breath of fresh, clean air, feeling the immense, crushing weight of the past 2 years finally lift from my shoulders. The war was officially over. The flashing lights of the police cruisers faded into the distance, and the neighborhood slowly returned to its quiet suburban rhythm. I turned around and looked at Jasmine. She was still standing on my front porch, entirely frozen in shock. She had no husband, no car, no money, and no future. I did not invite her back inside. I simply closed my heavy oak door, locked the deadbolt, and left her standing alone in the cold afternoon air to face the brutal consequences of her vanity. The wheels of the justice system ground forward with absolute ruthless efficiency. Arthur Harrington ensured the prosecutors had an airtight, ironclad case against every single one of them. The trial was a massive media spectacle, but it was incredibly swift because the audio recordings and financial paper trails were overwhelmingly undeniable. Kendall, my eldest son, the boy I had worked 80-hour weeks to support, was convicted of first-degree medical homicide, elder abuse, and conspiracy to commit murder. During the sentencing, he wept openly, begging the judge for a mercy he never showed his own mother. The judge showed zero leniency for his calculated cruelty, sentencing him to 25 years to life in a maximum security state penitentiary. Heather's polished corporate banking facade could not save her from the devastating reality of federal court. She was found guilty of grand embezzlement, wire fraud, and complicity in my wife's death. She received a mandatory minimum of 15 years and was permanently barred from the financial sector. Bradley's desperate real estate forgery earned him exactly what Arthur had predicted. The federal judge slammed the heavy wooden gavel and handed him 20 years for crossing state banking lines with a fraudulent deed. Jasmine was never officially charged with a crime because she was blissfully ignorant of the murder and the forgery, but her punishment was just as severe. Stripped of my financial safety net and hounded by her husband's violent loan sharks, she was quickly evicted from her luxury apartment. The superficial friends she tried so desperately to impress abandoned her instantly the moment her bank accounts dried up. Today, my daughter, who once spent thousands of dollars on designer handbags, takes the public bus at dawn to work minimum wage at a downtown diner. She scrubs grease off tables and serves coffee to strangers just to survive her massive mounting debts. Exactly 1 year after that chaotic afternoon, I walked through the tall wrought iron gates of the serene Memorial Park. The autumn air was crisp and clear, the exact kind of weather Diane always loved. I held a large bouquet of fresh white lilies, her absolute favorite flowers. I walked down the manicured stone path, hearing only the gentle rustle of the wind through the old oak trees until I reached her polished marble headstone. I knelt gently on the soft green grass, placing the lilies at the base of the monument. For the first time since she passed away, my heart was not weighed down by an oppressive, suffocating darkness. I looked at her beautifully engraved name and felt a profound, radiant peace wash over my entire being. I spoke to her out loud, my voice steady and completely devoid of sorrow. I told her the house was finally clean. The parasites had been permanently removed from our home, and her precious memory had been perfectly avenged. But I did not just come to deliver a status report on our children's long prison sentences. I came to tell her about the living, breathing legacy we had built together from the ashes of their horrific betrayal. I took the $5 million stock portfolio that Kendall had tried to steal along with the recovered $80,000 Heather had embezzled, and I established a massive charitable nonprofit organization. I proudly named it Diane's Light. I partnered directly with Arthur Harrington to create a formidable legal fortress for vulnerable seniors. Our foundation employs a dedicated team of aggressive attorneys, forensic accountants, and highly trained private investigators. We actively hunt down greedy relatives, corrupt doctors, and predatory bankers who try to exploit the elderly. We provide free emergency legal representation for widows and widowers who are being gaslighted, mentally manipulated, and robbed by their own flesh and blood. Just last week, our team successfully prosecuted a nephew who tried to forge a dementia diagnosis to steal his aunt's farm. I told Diane that her suffering was not in vain. Her meticulous bravery in those final days, recording those sinister conversations from her hospital bed, provided the exact blueprint we now use to save hundreds of innocent lives across the country. I spend my days running the foundation board, reviewing active cases, and personally confronting abusers in courtrooms alongside our lawyers. The immense fortune I amassed over 40 years of grueling labor is no longer a magnet for greedy, ungrateful children. It has been transformed into a blazing beacon of justice and protection for those who cannot fight for themselves. I stood up from the grass, brushing the damp dirt from my knees. I looked around the quiet, peaceful cemetery, taking a long, deep breath of the fresh morning air. At 69 years old, I have learned the hardest, most agonizing lesson a father could ever possibly learn. We spend our entire lives sacrificing our own comfort, working our fingers to the bone to build a mountain of wealth, believing we are paving a smooth, safe road for our children. We think our money will shield them from the harsh realities of the world. But unearned privilege is a dangerous, silent poison. It rots the human soul and breeds a monstrous, terrifying entitlement. Money does not change people. It merely unmasks them. It strips away the polite society manners and reveals the true ravenous, predatory nature hiding underneath the surface. Blood simply makes you related. It is nothing more than a biological accident. But loyalty, respect, honor, and protecting one another unconditionally, that is what truly makes you a family. When I discovered the horrifying truth about my wife's death, I made the most difficult choice of my life. I chose to amputate my own infected limbs so the rest of my body could survive the poison. I cut out the toxicity, and in return, I gained absolute, unshackled freedom. I no longer live in constant fear of the people sitting at my own dining room table. I live a beautiful life of profound purpose, surrounded by genuine colleagues at the foundation, and the beautiful memory of a wife who loved me for the man I was, not the bank account I provided. My story ended up being a harsh, terrifying warning about the darkest corners of human greed. But it is also a powerful testament to the undeniable power of truth and the unbreakable strength of a man who absolutely refuses to be a victim. Did you like my story? And which city are you listening from? Let's meet in the comments. If you like the story, you can support me by sending a super thanks so I can keep bringing more stories like this. Thank you so much for your sweet support. I am looking forward to your comments on the story. On the screen, you can see 2 new life stories that I highly recommend. There is so much more on my channel. Do not forget to subscribe. See you in the next life story with love and respect. Another profound lesson I carry with me is that aging does not equate to powerlessness. Society conditions us to believe that getting older makes us fragile and that we must silently accept the decisions our younger relatives make for us. But wisdom is a weapon sharpened by decades of experience. When you sense a shift in how you are treated, when respect is replaced by condescension and greed, you must trust your instincts. Do not let anyone, especially your own blood, manipulate you into doubting your own mind or surrendering your autonomy. Your golden years are meant for peace, not for being a pawn in someone else's financial game. Please share this video with anyone who needs the courage to stand up for themselves and take back control of their life.